This is a story that has fascinated people for decades. It's one of those cases that, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't seem to make sense. In 1979, the New York Times called it one of the Western world's most convincing cases of reincarnation. Now, a lot of stories about past lives are hard to verify. There's usually no real proof you can point to today. But this one is different. This is the story of a woman named Dorothy Edy, who later became known as Omm Sety. And her life story and the things she claimed to remember from a past life led to real, verifiable, modern-day discoveries in Egypt. Things that professional Egyptologists and historians just couldn't explain. For decades, they tried to prove she was a fraud, that she was lying. And they never could. She knew things she just shouldn't have known. Things that make you stop and wonder, what if she was telling the truth? Our story begins in London in 1904. Dorothy Edy was born into a lower middle-class family. She was an only child, and her parents absolutely adored her. Life was normal, quiet, and happy for the first 3 years. And then, one day, everything changed. Little 3-year-old Dorothy was playing in her home when she took a terrible fall down a flight of stairs. She was knocked completely unconscious. Her parents were frantic. They called for the family doctor, who rushed over to the house. He examined Dorothy, and after a few moments, he had to deliver the worst news imaginable. He turned to her parents and told them their daughter was dead. The next hour was just a blur of grief for her parents. The doctor was there, trying to console them, talking about what needed to happen next. They were in a state of total shock. But then, about an hour after the doctor had pronounced her dead, they heard something, a sound coming from Dorothy's bedroom. They went to check, and they could not believe their eyes. There was Dorothy, sitting up on her bed, playing as if nothing had happened. They rushed in, the doctor right behind them, and they were all just speechless. Dorothy seemed perfectly fine. Her parents, in their confusion and relief, turned on the doctor. They were furious, yelling at him for pronouncing her dead when she was clearly alive. But the doctor was adamant. He swore she had been gone. He had checked for a pulse, for breath. There was nothing. He had no medical explanation for what had just happened. In the days and weeks after the accident, Dorothy's parents noticed some changes. The biggest one was her voice. She started speaking with a strange accent, one they couldn't place at all. They took her to doctors and specialists who suggested she might be suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome. It's a real medical condition that can happen after a significant head injury, and it basically alters a person's speech patterns. To someone who doesn't know, it can sound like they suddenly have a foreign accent. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Dorothy also started talking about a recurring dream. She told her parents that every night she would dream of a huge building with massive pillars. And right next to this building was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. She would describe the flowers, the trees, the feeling of peace she had when she was there. It was like an oasis. She loved this garden more than anything. But in the dream, she didn't know where it was. And being just 3 or 4 years old, she had a hard time articulating exactly what she was seeing. All she knew was that she loved this place in her dreams, and she talked about it constantly. It got to the point where her mother would often find her crying in her bed, either before going to sleep or right after waking up. When her mother asked what was wrong, Dorothy would say she wanted to go home. Her mother would try to reassure her, saying, "But honey, you are home." And Dorothy would shake her head and insist, "No, I'm not. My home is there, in the garden." She was completely convinced that the place in her dreams was her real home, and nothing her parents said could change her mind. A little while later, when Dorothy was still very young, her parents decided to take her on a trip to the British Museum. The museum had a large exhibit on ancient Egypt. As they walked in, Dorothy spotted the Egyptian section from across the room. Her eyes went wide. She saw the towering statues of pharaohs, the pictures of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and then she just took off. She sprinted away from her parents, running straight into the exhibit. She ran up to the statues, these ancient stone figures, and started kissing their feet. She was sobbing, completely overcome with emotion, and yelling out loud, "I'm home! I'm home! I'm with my people!" This tiny little girl was having this huge emotional revelation right there in the middle of the museum. Her parents were mortified. People were staring, wondering what on earth was wrong with their child. They eventually managed to calm her down and get her to leave, but something had clicked into place for Dorothy. From that day forward, she knew. The beautiful garden from her dreams, the place she longed for, was in Egypt. Her newfound obsession with ancient Egypt started to cause problems. Her family was very devoutly Catholic, and they sent her to Sunday school. But Dorothy would constantly compare the teachings of Catholicism with what she knew about ancient Egyptian religions. This did not go over well. Eventually, the church told her she couldn't come to Sunday school anymore. Then, she was expelled from her Catholic school. The reason was that she refused to sing certain hymns, specifically ones that she felt were disrespectful to the ancient Egyptians. She was even barred from attending Sunday Mass. By the age of 6, Dorothy, who was already a good reader and writer in English, became fascinated with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The moment she saw them, she said they felt familiar, but it was like a language she had forgotten how to read. When she was 7 years old, she was looking through a book one day when she saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Temple of Seti I, which is in a place called Abydos, Egypt. The picture showed the Grand Temple, and next to it were the crumbling remains of what looked like it might have once been a garden. As soon as Dorothy saw it, she pointed and said, "That's it. That's my home." She was absolutely certain. That temple in Abydos was where she was from. She looked closer at the picture, at the broken, tattered remains next to the temple walls. "That's the garden," she said. "But where are all the trees? Why does it look like this?" She couldn't understand that thousands of years had passed. In her mind, she was seeing her home, but it was ruined. The textbook also had a picture of the pharaoh the temple was named after, Seti I. When she saw the image of his very well-preserved mummy, she was once again overcome with emotion. She said she had known him. She remembered him personally. This incredible knowledge didn't go unnoticed. At age 10, she caught the attention of a world-renowned Egyptologist named A. Wallace Budge. He was so impressed by her passion and her strange familiarity with the subject that he offered to personally teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics. She picked it up almost instantly, as if she were just remembering something she already knew. As she got older, the dreams continued. But starting around age 14, a new one began. It was a nightmare. In this nightmare, she was trapped in a dark underground room. A high priest was there, interrogating her, demanding she answer his questions. When she refused, he had her beaten. This dream would haunt her for years. Fast forward to when Dorothy, now called Edy, was 27. She met an Egyptian man, and they fell in love. But it's also very likely she saw the marriage as a way to finally get to Egypt. She wanted to secure Egyptian residency. As soon as they were married, they moved. The moment their boat landed in Egypt, Edy was overwhelmed. She got down on her hands and knees, kissed the ground, and cried, saying over and over again, "I'm home. I'm finally home." She and her husband soon had a son, and in a move that surprised no one who knew her, they named him Seti. Once she was living in Egypt, Edy's experiences became even more intense. She claimed she started receiving nightly visits from a spiritual entity she called Hora. She believed Hora was the spirit of the pharaoh, Seti I. For about a year, these visits would happen almost every night. Her husband would wake up in the middle of the night to find her in a trance-like state. She would be sitting up, her eyes glazed over, frantically writing in a notebook. But she wasn't writing in English. She was writing page after page of perfect, intricate hieroglyphics. Her husband said he couldn't snap her out of it. It was like she was possessed, just writing and writing. Edy later explained that Hora was dictating her life story to her, the story of who she used to be. Over the course of that year, she filled over 70 pages with this story, all written in hieroglyphics. And the story went like this. Before she was Dorothy Edy, she was an Egyptian woman named Bentrashite, which means harp of joy. She had lived 3,000 years earlier during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a simple vegetable seller. Her mother died when Bentrashite was only 3 years old. Her father, unable to care for her on his own, placed her in the temple at Qom el-Sultan, which was near Abydos. She was raised in the temple and eventually became a priestess. When she turned 12, she was given a choice. She could either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own, or she could stay and become a consecrated virgin, dedicating her life to the gods. Bentrashit chose to stay and took the vows. But a few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I. They fell in love and began a secret relationship. Soon after, she discovered she was pregnant. For a consecrated virgin priestess, this was a catastrophic transgression. The high priest of the temple found out and interrogated her fiercely, demanding to know the name of the father. This interrogation, she realized, was the scene from her recurring nightmare. He had her beaten when she refused to name Seti. Bentrashit knew that if the truth came out, it would cause a massive public scandal for the pharaoh, the man she loved. Unwilling to let that happen, she took her own life. This entire experience, the nightly trances, the obsessive writing of hieroglyphics, the bizarre story of a past life, was all too much for Edy's husband. He grew more and more disturbed by her behavior. In 1936, he filed for divorce. After the divorce, Dorothy and her young son, Seti, moved to a town near the Giza pyramids. It was around this time that she stopped going by Dorothy Edy. She adopted a new name, Omm Sety, which in Arabic means Mother of Seti. She was fully embracing her new identity, one that was deeply connected to ancient Egypt. She soon took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, beginning a long and surprisingly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Omm Sety dedicated her life to her work. She researched and wrote and drew, becoming an expert. Her primary focus, of course, was the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. She learned everything there was to know about its history, its architecture, and the people who lived and worked there 3,000 years ago. It was, after all, the place she believed had been her home. But incredibly, for all those years, she never actually went there. It wasn't until 1952, when she was almost 50 years old, that she finally got the chance to set foot in Abydos. A job transfer came up, and she jumped at the opportunity. In fact, she was so desperate to go that she even took a significant pay cut to get the position. The moment she walked into the temple grounds, she felt a profound sense of familiarity. The first thing she said was, "It's as if I've lived here before." She quickly set up an office for herself in one of the temple's rooms and spent nearly all of her time there, working and just being in the space. She even developed a strange friendship with a wild cobra that lived on the grounds. She would feed it every day, and the snake would just hang out with her. Nobody could make sense of it. Rumors flew around about this eccentric Englishwoman, but her contributions to Egyptology were so significant and so valuable that she earned the deep respect of her colleagues, even if they thought her personal beliefs were strange. But of all her accomplishments, Omm Sety is most famous for what happened shortly after she arrived at the temple. She had been dreaming of that beautiful garden her entire life. She walked around the crumbling exterior of the temple, and then she pointed to a specific spot. She told the chief inspector of antiquities that if they dug right there, they would find the temple garden. The archaeologists were skeptical. There were no records, no texts, nothing to suggest a garden had ever been in that location. But Omm Sety was so certain. She didn't just point to the spot, she described the entire layout. She told them where the pathways would be, what kinds of trees they would find, and where those trees were planted. To appease her, and probably to prove her wrong, they decided to dig. And they were stunned. They dug down, and there it was. A garden. Exactly where she said it would be. And as they excavated, they found that the layout, the root systems of the ancient trees, everything matched her descriptions perfectly. This was information she could not have possibly known. It wasn't written down anywhere. But that was just the beginning. She then told them to excavate on the north side of the temple. She said there was a secret, undiscovered tunnel that ran underneath the temple from that side. Again, the archaeologists were doubtful. But again, they dug. And sure enough, there was the tunnel. It was a major discovery, and only she knew about it. Her uncanny knowledge didn't stop at the temple. She also pointed researchers to a specific unexplored area in the Valley of the Kings, a famous burial ground for pharaohs. She told them they would find a long-forgotten tomb there. They searched where she indicated, and they found a tomb that had never been discovered before. Time and time again, she provided information that led to incredible finds. The other Egyptologists, the scientists and academics, they didn't want to believe her story about reincarnation. They wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a strange woman, maybe an elaborate and clever hoax. But they were faced with a problem they couldn't solve. They couldn't deny the results. She possessed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the Temple of Seti I and the surrounding area during the exact time frame she claimed to have lived there as Bentreshit. They simply could not explain how she knew what she knew. Right before she passed away at the age of 81, Omm Sety shared one final secret. She said that deep beneath the Temple of Seti I, there is a secret chamber. And inside that chamber, there is another secret, a library of records or a hidden tomb, something of incredible importance. But she passed away before she could give more specific directions. No one knows exactly where to begin looking. And so, without Omm Sety to guide them, her final secret may be one that is lost to time. Her story leaves us with so many questions. Without any logical, rational explanation for her knowledge, for her ability to pinpoint lost gardens and secret tunnels, even skeptics are left to wonder. Was she a brilliant hoaxer who somehow found lost information that no one else could? Or was Dorothy Edy, the little girl from London, truly the reincarnation of a priestess from ancient Egypt? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2010, an explorer named Jeff, a guy who was really passionate about caving, decided to take a trip to Madagascar. This wasn't just a vacation for him. He had a very specific goal in mind. Years earlier, on a previous trip, he had stumbled across a natural cave shaft, a deep hole in the ground that just seemed to call out to him. He'd made notes about it, logged its location, and had been dreaming about coming back to properly explore it ever since. For a caver like Jeff, an unexplored shaft is like an unsolved mystery, and he was finally ready to go find some answers. So, he flies into Madagascar, goes through all the usual travel motions, and gets himself a rental car. He knew the general area where the cave was, but it was remote, not the kind of place you just plug into a GPS. He needed local knowledge to get close, so he hired a guide, a man from a nearby village, to take him out into the wilderness. After a long and bumpy drive, they finally arrived in the region Jeff recognized from his last trip. He pulled out his old, worn notebook, flipping through the pages until he found his hand-drawn maps and coordinates. He used those notes to pinpoint the exact location, and sure enough, there it was. A dark, narrow opening in the earth, about a meter across, just as he remembered it. He paid the guide for his time and asked him to wait by the car. He tried to reassure the man, telling him he wouldn't be gone for a very long time. The plan was simple: rappel down, check out the bottom, and come straight back up. The guide just sort of nodded, probably thinking this foreigner was a little crazy for wanting to go down a hole in the middle of nowhere. Jeff laid out all his gear. He was meticulous, a professional. He had his ropes, his harness, his helmet with a headlamp, and his backpack. Inside that backpack was his technical ascending gear, the specialized equipment he would need to climb back up the rope. The shaft itself was about 50 meters deep. That's over 160 feet. The first 20 meters or so were on a bit of an angle, a steep slide downwards. But after that, the final 30 meters were a straight, vertical drop into blackness. From what Jeff could tell, there was a small chamber at the bottom, just big enough to stand up and walk around in, but there were no other tunnels leading off from it. This was a simple in-and-out job. Go down, touch the bottom, come back up. One of the challenges of a shaft like this is the visibility. The opening was so narrow that as soon as Jeff started his descent, his own body would block most of the sunlight. A few meters down, he'd be relying completely on his headlamp to see. With his gear checked and his rope secured, he gave the guide a final wave and started his descent. He moved slowly and confidently, the rough rock walls brushing against him as he made his way down the first 20 meters of the angled slope. Everything was going perfectly. He reached the 20-meter mark, the point where the shaft transitioned from an angle to a straight vertical drop. He paused for a moment, adjusting his position on the rope, getting ready for the final 30-meter descent into the darkness below. And that's when he saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye right at the edge of his headlamp's beam. He instinctively turned his head, focusing the light on the wall of the shaft to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. The wall was moving. It was covered in thousands of tiny, black, shiny bodies scattering away from the light. They were black widow spiders. Thousands upon thousands of them. He swung his light around, and his heart hammered in his chest. The entire vertical section of the shaft, from where he was hanging all the way down to the bottom, was a living, moving carpet of black widows. He was frozen in place, suspended on a rope 30 meters above the bottom of the cave, completely surrounded by one of the most venomous spiders in the world. His first instinct, his only instinct, was to get out. He wanted to stop right there, turn around, and climb back up to the surface as fast as he possibly could. But he couldn't. And that was the real problem. To go back up the rope he was currently on, he needed his ascending gear. And his ascending gear was packed away neatly and safely inside his backpack, which was strapped to his back. Trying to swing around, take his pack off, fish out the gear, and set it up while dangling in the middle of a spider-infested shaft would be incredibly dangerous. It was a recipe for a fatal fall. So he was trapped. He had only one option, and it was the last thing in the world he wanted to do. He had to continue his descent. He had to go down the final 30 meters right through the heart of the spider nest to reach the bottom of the cave. Only then could he safely take his pack off, get his gear out, and begin the climb back up. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked down into the darkness, knowing what was waiting for him. And then he began his slow, awful descent. With every meter he lowered himself, the reality of his situation became more intense. Periodically, his body would bump against the wall, and he'd hear the sickening rustle of thousands of spiders scattering around him. He could feel them. He saw them climbing onto the sleeves of his shirt, and he'd have to brush them off, trying not to panic. He saw them on the rope itself right above his hands, and he'd frantically try to knock them away before he had to grab that section of rope. It was a living nightmare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his feet touched the solid ground at the bottom of the shaft. He was standing in the small chamber, but he was far from safe. He could hear the spiders all around him, a constant, quiet crawling sound on the walls. He quickly shrugged off his backpack and shone his light on it. It was covered in spiders. He carefully unzipped it, and more spiders crawled out from inside. He had to reach in, carefully pushing past the spiders, to pull out his ascending gear. Once he had it, he didn't waste a second. He threw his pack back on, attached the gear to the rope, and began making his way back up. The whole time, he was in a constant battle, brushing spiders off his clothes, his gear, his body. It was a slow and terrifying climb, but the growing circle of light from the entrance above him gave him strength. Finally, he pulled himself over the edge and collapsed onto the ground, back in the sunlight, back in the fresh air. The first thing he did, without even thinking, was strip off all his clothing. He had to get any remaining spiders off of him. He shook out his shirt, his pants, everything. He took his bag, turned it upside down, and dumped everything out. More spiders fell to the ground. You can only imagine what the guide was thinking, just sitting by the car, watching this foreigner emerge from a hole in the ground and immediately start taking all his clothes off. But Jeff didn't care. After he was sure he was spider-free, he got dressed again. He walked over to the car, and the guide just looked at him, not saying a word. Miraculously, Jeff hadn't been bitten a single time. As they started the long drive back towards the city, Jeff took out his notebook. He found the page for this particular cave. The name he had originally given it from his first visit was the Crooked Tube. He took his pen and scratched that name out with a thick, angry line. And above it, in big, clear letters, he wrote a new name, The Entrance to Hell. Back in 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. But this wasn't your typical farm with cows and cornfields. It was a pine tree farm. His family's business was harvesting and baling pine straw, which is a big commodity in the landscaping world. Their house was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly planted pine trees, lined up in neat, endless rows. They were totally isolated. They didn't have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one long, straight road that led onto the property. From the main house, they could look out and see all the way down that road, right through the rows of trees. This meant it was basically impossible for anyone to visit without being spotted long before they arrived. The house itself was built on a very slight hill. To keep it level, one side of the house was effectively built up on stilts. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. This created a strange effect. If you were in the living room looking out the window, you were actually looking down at the ground at a steep angle. It felt like you were on the second story, even though you were on the first. And the window in that living room was unique. It was huge, stretching almost the entire length of the room, nearly 50 feet across. At night, that window was kind of creepy, because you could see so clearly down the long, straight rows of trees, you'd often see animals darting between the trunks in the darkness. That alone was enough to give you a weird feeling. But it was the size of the window that really got to people. When you were in that room at night, with the lights on inside and pure blackness outside, you just felt incredibly exposed. Like you were on a stage. Between the creepy animals and the feeling of vulnerability, the family basically avoided using the living room at all after the sun went down. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with them for a visit. Since the main house didn't have any extra bedrooms, the only place for the boys to sleep was in the living room. There were 2 couches in there. One was positioned right underneath that giant 50-foot window. The other was on the opposite side of the room, against a solid wall with no window. Evan, being the host, took the couch under the window, and his cousin took the other one. The first night his cousin was there, they tried to make it a little less creepy. They found a big sheet and hung it up over the window, but it wasn't big enough. It only covered about 75% of the glass, leaving the 2 ends of the window, the flanks, totally exposed. Still, it blocked the main view from where their couches were, so it gave them a little sense of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the 2 boys finally fell asleep around midnight. A couple of hours later, they were woken up by the sound of Evan's dogs barking. They were way off in the pine trees, somewhere out in the darkness. Now, Evan was used to his dogs. They were always running around the property, barking at squirrels or raccoons, so the sound of barking itself wasn't a red flag. But this time, the barking didn't stop. It was persistent and had an urgent tone to it. It was so continuous that it eventually made Evan's cousin get up off his couch. He walked across the room to the part of the window that wasn't covered by the sheet, right at the foot of Evan's couch, and peered out into the night. Evan was still lying down. He wasn't about to get up and look out the window himself, so he just watched his cousin's face, trying to get a read on what he was seeing. He noticed his cousin had this really perplexed look. He was squinting his eyes, leaning closer to the glass, like he was trying to make sense of something. So Evan whispered to him, "Hey, what's going on?" "What do you see?" His cousin replied, his voice a little shaky. "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At that, Evan jumped off the couch and ran over to the window, getting right up next to his cousin to see for himself. He scanned the rows of trees. The first thing he noticed was that the moon was very bright that night, and there was a light dusting of snow on the ground which made everything seem to glow. It was actually pretty easy to see. He was looking out, maybe about 100 meters into the woods, when he saw it. Someone's leg extended out from behind one of the pine trees, as if they were about to step into the open space between two rows. Evan just stared, his mind racing. He couldn't believe he was seeing a person. Nobody ever came onto their property, especially not in the middle of the night. Then, a body followed the leg. A tall, dark figure walked calmly from one row of trees to the next, disappearing behind another tree. Evan grabbed his cousin's arm. "Did you just see that?" His cousin just nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, I saw that." They continued to stare in the direction where the person had gone. A couple of minutes passed in total silence. Then they saw another leg emerge, going the other way, back towards where the first person had come from. The legs stepped out into the gap, and another tall figure walked across. Except this time, instead of going straight across, it looked like they were moving at a slight angle, an angle that was bringing them closer to the house. The boys looked at each other, not knowing what to do. They were terrified. So they just kept looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they were looking, they saw the person emerge again. Except now, they weren't 100 meters away anymore. They were maybe 20 meters away. They had closed the distance impossibly fast, and the boys hadn't seen them move. This time, when the leg came out from behind the pine tree, the figure didn't walk across the gap. It stopped, right in the middle, in the open. And then it turned its head and looked directly at the boys in the window. And then it began to run straight toward them. The boys practically fell over each other trying to get away from the window. Evan started yelling for his father, who was asleep upstairs. Instinctively, the two boys just started running around the house, locking every single door, shutting every single window. As they went from door to door, the anxiety was building and building. They were thinking, if I don't get this lock turned fast enough, that person who was running at us is going to come barging right through. At every door, their fear was through the roof. They managed to get everything shut and locked just as Evan's father came charging down the stairs. He had his gun in his hand and he was yelling, "What's going on?" They quickly told him that there was someone on the property. Without hesitating, their dad charged out the front door. The front door wasn't on the same wall as the big living room window. It was on the side of the house. So once he was outside, he had to turn to the right to look out in the direction the boys had described. He stood on the porch and just started yelling into the darkness, screaming at whoever was out there that if they came any closer, he was going to shoot them. He screamed for them to get away from his house. And then there was just silence. The boys waited inside, peering around, checking the window. They didn't see anything. After a minute, their dad came back inside, shut the heavy door, and locked it. He looked at Evan and said, "Keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know." Looking back on it later, Evan would say that they really should have called 911 right then. But as a kid, he just understood that that wasn't how his family operated. They took care of things themselves. So even with a strange person running at their house, calling the police just wasn't the first thought. His dad was effectively telling him to be a lookout. So Evan and his cousin went back into the living room. They were apprehensive, but they slowly crept up to the window and looked out. After 5 or 10 minutes of seeing nothing, they started to calm down a little. They reasoned with each other that Evan's dad was a pretty intimidating guy. He had just been outside, screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. They figured the person, or people, probably got the message and were long gone. So the boys got back onto their couches. It took them a long time, but eventually they did fall back asleep. The next morning, when the boys woke up, the first thing they wanted to do was go outside. They needed to see if they could find any footprints. Part of them still thought that maybe they had imagined the whole thing, that their minds were playing tricks on them in the dark. So they went out the front door and walked around the side of the house down into the trees where they had seen the figures. And they found them. Footprints in the light snow. It was a confirmation. Okay, someone was definitely out here. It wasn't them. These weren't their footprints. They started following the tracks back towards the house. And that's when they realized something even more disturbing. At a certain point, they could see that there weren't just one set of footprints. There were two distinct sets. There had been two people out there in the dark. And it got even worse. They followed the two sets of footprints all the way up to the house. And they found two different circles of trampled snow, where the people had been standing for a long time. The footprints stopped right underneath the living room window, one circle on each side, in the exact spots along the flanks of the window where the sheet had not been covering the glass. The horrible realization washed over them. Over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were standing at that window, looking out into the trees, there was a very good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up right against the side of the house in their blind spot. Because of that steep downward angle from the living room window, anyone pressed up against the wall would have been completely invisible. And then, for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into their beds and were sleeping, there were two strangers standing right there, just feet away, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father saw the footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun again and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from. But the snow cover was patchy, and at some point the tracks just disappeared. They never figured out who those two people were. Evan would later say that after that night, his cousin refused to ever come over for a sleepover again. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California. He was visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her place was in a really safe complex. It was gated, there were lights everywhere, cameras, the whole deal. It was the kind of place where if you heard something go bump in the night, you just assumed it was a noisy neighbor or a cat knocking something over. It wasn't a place you worried about. On the last night of his stay, Nathan was lying in bed in the guest room. He was listening to the familiar, comforting sounds of the night, the low hum of the street lamp just outside his window, the chirping of crickets, and the distant sound of cars passing by on the main road. He drifted off to sleep to that gentle soundtrack. At about 2 a.m, Nathan woke up. Or at least, he thought he woke up. He found that he couldn't move his body at all. He could move his eyes, darting them around the room, but the rest of him was completely paralyzed. He had never experienced sleep paralysis before, but instinctively, he understood that this must be what it was. He also noticed that the room was completely silent. The hum of the street lamp was gone. The crickets were quiet. There was no more traffic noise. Just total unnerving silence. He started flashing his eyes around the room, trying to take stock of his surroundings since he couldn't move his head. The bed he was in was positioned in the back right corner, as far away from the door as possible. From where he was lying, if he looked to his right, in the corner there was a big, heavy armoire. As he scanned his eyes to the left from the armoire, he came to the bedroom door, which was on the opposite side of the room from his bed. If he kept scanning left, his eyes would reach the foot of his bed. And just beyond the foot of his bed, he knew there was a small table and a chair. But because he was lying flat on his back, he couldn't actually see that part of the room. With all the strength he could muster, he managed to raise his head just a few inches off the pillow, just enough so he could get a line of sight to that one section of the room he hadn't been able to see yet. He saw the table and the chair. And he saw, standing in the corner next to them, a dark figure. It was just standing there, looking at him. He was completely frozen with fear. His first thought was that there was an intruder in the house. How did they get in? What were they doing in his room? He managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure. He determined it was most likely a woman, and she had a shawl or a veil covering her face. And then, just before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of his view. Nathan's head fell back, and now he was just lying there, paralyzed, knowing there was a stranger in his room. He couldn't lift his head anymore. He was staring at the ceiling, looking around with his eyes, seeing the armoire, seeing the door, but unable to see the corner where she was. And then he heard a sound. It was the sound of someone slithering along the ground just out of his sight. He could hear her breathing. And she was getting closer and closer to the edge of his bed. He was lying there, absolutely terrified, so scared he couldn't even make a sound. He kept telling himself, "This has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up." And then, this woman, she stood up, she leaned out over his bed and looked down at him. Her face was pale, almost white, and her eyes were dark and sunk way back in her head. Then she began to slowly crawl on top of him. Nathan was just staring up at her. He wanted to close his eyes, to look away, but he couldn't. He just felt his chest being pressed down, the weight of her on him. He could hear the sounds of the mattress springs compressing all around him as this woman positioned herself on his chest. And then finally, he managed to let out a scream. And just like that, he was awake. The woman was gone. He shot up in bed, looking around frantically. There was nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the street lamp and the sound of the crickets and the traffic outside all returned at once. His mom came running into the room. "Hey, are you okay?" "I heard screaming in here." He was still catching his breath. "Oh, no. I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." His mom looked at him, concerned. "Okay, all right. You need anything?" He shook his head. "Nope." So she came over, gave him a hug and a kiss, and went back to her own bed. Nathan, however, couldn't go back to sleep. He went downstairs, flipped on the TV, and put on a Disney movie, Aladdin. He fell asleep on the couch with the movie and all the lights on. He didn't have any more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and headed back to his own house. But he couldn't shake the experience. It was so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. He just kept thinking to himself, "I can't believe there are people who put up with this on a regular basis." But, after a couple of days of being home and not experiencing it again, time went on and he just kind of pushed it to the back of his mind. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan was at a big family party in Chico, California. It was a big outdoor barbecue. All of his family was there. At some point, his sister showed up. This was a great surprise. She wasn't supposed to be able to make it, and he hadn't seen her in a while. He immediately pulled her aside so they could catch up. They spent the first hour just chatting about their lives, what they were up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to tell her about his sleep paralysis experience. The reason he wanted to tell her, specifically, was because he knew that she knew he was a total skeptic. If he told her this is what happened, she would believe that's what he genuinely saw, and she wouldn't think he was making it up or exaggerating. So he started by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis." His sister immediately cut him off. Her eyes went wide. "Wait a minute," she said. "I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room, and then I saw this woman, and she was standing on me. I thought I was going to die. It was horrible." Nathan just stared at her. "That's exactly what happened to me. I was lying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest." They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. The silent room, the figure in the corner, the feeling of being crushed. At the end of it, they just sat there trying to find a rational explanation for how they both could have had their one and only sleep paralysis experience in the same room around the same time and see the exact same thing. It was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them was really prepared to start discussing what else it could be, some paranormal explanation. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off nervously and say, man, that's pretty weird. And they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan went back to his house and told his wife about the crazy coincidence he and his sister had discovered. His wife agreed that it was wild, but after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it anymore. He pushed it out of his mind and moved on with his life. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom moved out of that apartment building and into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come and spend a couple of nights with her, just to help her settle in. And Nathan said, sure. In order to understand what happens next, you need a basic layout of her new house. When you walk in through the double front doors, to your left is a formal living room. In the center of the house, a hallway shoots straight back to the kitchen. And to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall are the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs up, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks out into the backyard. Immediately to your right, on that landing, there is a single door. That's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turn to your left, there would be another door, a mirror image of the master bedroom door. This door was the guest room, and that's where Nathan was going to stay. If you went inside that guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, the same layout as the guest room in the old apartment building. For someone lying in the bed, their feet would be closest to the door. From Nathan's perspective, in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new guest room was a table against the right-hand wall, and on that table was a TV. The first night Nathan stayed at the new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, lying on the bed, watching TV. The lights in the room were off, so it was just the glow from the television. At some point, he dozed off. He woke up a short time later, and he couldn't move. It was the same sensation he had felt before back at his mom's apartment. He began to panic. The last time he felt this way, a strange, veiled woman stood on his chest and made him feel like he was dying. So immediately, he was trying to move his body, but he couldn't. Using just his eyes, he started looking around the room, praying that this woman was not in there with him. He looked to the right, to the corner. He could see it clearly. There was no one there. From that corner, he scanned his eyes across the room. He saw the TV. It was still on. He kept scanning, and he saw the door. It was open. And then he scanned further and was just barely able to make out the space at the foot of his bed all the way to the corner. The woman, she wasn't in the room. Initially, he felt this incredible wave of relief. She's not here. But then he found himself focusing on the open door, which led out into the dark hallway. And he was thinking to himself, please, please, do not come walking through that door. So he just stared at the open doorway, hoping he would break out of the sleep paralysis. That's when he noticed something about the TV. It was flickering. He averted his gaze from the door to the TV screen. And he realized that what he was looking at on the TV did not look familiar. It didn't look like a TV show. It looked like CCTV camera footage. Like security camera footage. And then he realized the footage he was looking at was of the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the layout, the cabinets. That was his mother's house. He was staring at the footage thinking, why is this playing on my TV? I don't think there's even a camera down there. And as he's thinking this, he sees on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. She stops, and she looks up directly at the camera. Right as she does, the TV turns off. The room was now completely dark. There was no more ambient light. The hallway was dark. And he was left there, paralyzed in bed, knowing that this woman was downstairs in the kitchen. As he's lying there in the terrifying silence, he hears her start to run through the house. It sounded like an animal, barreling into things as she ran through the bottom floor. He heard her crash around, and then the sound stopped right at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. As he's lying there, he can feel his heart racing, and he's staring at that open black doorway. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and through that door. But instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one slow step. Then, a second slow step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, one step at a time, he's just thinking, please break out of this. Stop this paralysis. Wake up. Wake up. And then he sees her head emerge above the floor line. She turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around the corner and starts charging into his room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is absolutely scared for his life as this woman charges towards him. She stops dead in her tracks, right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges back downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was gone, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's old apartment. Back then, when he sat up, he had a sensation of relief, like you've woken up, you were asleep before, but now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he could just suddenly move. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled. She's half asleep. And she says, Was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her, and he can't even process what he's just been through. He didn't know if it was real or if it was a dream. He was trying to find the words to describe what had just happened, but he couldn't. He just looked at his mom and said, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. So the two of them flipped on every light upstairs. They weren't even talking at this point. It was just survival mode. They turned on all the lights, and Nathan led the way down the stairs. They went through the whole house, flicking on every light, and they managed to search the whole place. There was no sign of a break-in. There was no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to talk about what had just happened. Nathan just laid it all out. He said, Okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. A few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your old apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was lying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying. But then, a couple of months after that, I talked to my sister, and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that same room, and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we both had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house. And you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She said to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment a long time ago. But I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, she showed up in the room and she stood on me and it scared the heck out of me. But I didn't tell anyone because I just thought it was sleep paralysis. Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same, very specific, terrifying experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed just sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan running around, he was paralyzed in his bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her own bedroom. And she didn't have any pets. So who, or what, could it have been? Nathan says that he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they still don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last terrifying experience Nathan had at her new house. And they're just hoping it stays that way. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Early on the morning of the 19th of August, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley was standing in his newly renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. It was the start of another long workday, just like any other. He walked over to his refrigerator, opened the door, and the cool air washed over him for a moment. He reached inside and grabbed the bag lunch his wife had packed for him, and next to it, his trusty thermos. He was just about to walk out the door, ready to start the day, but he stopped himself. He turned back and saw his wife, Joanne, and gave her a quick kiss on the cheek. He told her he loved her, and then he finally left for the day. Bobby and Joanne had been married for about a year. They lived together with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter from a previous relationship, a little girl named Angela. Their home was a simple duplex in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. Bobby worked as an electrician, and he was good at his job. He made a decent living, enough to support his new family, but they certainly weren't wealthy. Life was good, but it was a life built on hard work and careful budgeting. But Bobby knew that their financial situation might be about to change, and change in a very big way. His wife Joanne was on the verge of winning a huge court settlement. You see, Joanne had been married once before, but her first husband had died in a tragic car accident about 3 years earlier. His car had collided with a tractor-trailer, and after a long investigation, the driver of that truck was found to be at fault. And so, for the past few years, Joanne's lawyers had been in a long, drawn-out battle with the trucking company's lawyers. They were working to finalize a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for the wrongful death of her first husband. It had been an incredibly stressful process for everyone, especially for Joanne. Bobby had noticed that she seemed more on edge, more sullen and stressed out than usual as the legal proceedings dragged on. But now, it seemed like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The case was finally wrapping up, and Joanne's mood had started to improve. She seemed to be getting back to her old self. And while nothing was set in stone just yet, the word from the lawyers was that they were likely going to receive a settlement of around $1 million. For a hardworking family like the Curleys, $1 million was a life-changing amount of money. It was almost hard to comprehend. The two of them had already started talking about what they might do with it, dreaming about the future. They talked about taking little Angela on some big trips, showing her parts of the world she'd only seen in books. And they also talked about using some of that money to finally fund Bobby's biggest dream. He had always wanted to start his own electrical business, to be his own boss, but he'd never had the resources to make it happen. This settlement could change all of that. But for now, those were just dreams. The settlement wasn't finalized, and the bills still needed to be paid. So Bobby had to go to his regular 9-to-5 job, punch the clock, and keep earning a steady paycheck for his family. And so, on this particular morning, after saying goodbye to Joanne, he got into his car and started the short drive to his current job site. About 10 minutes later, Bobby pulled up and parked outside a large science building on the campus of Wilkes University, a small local college in Wilkes-Barre. He could see some of the other guys on his crew already standing out front, waiting for him to arrive so they could get inside and start working. Bobby was the foreman of their crew, so he was the one with the keys. He got out of his car, said good morning to everyone, and walked up to the building to unlock the heavy doors. Then, as a group, they all headed inside to begin another long day of work. Working at this location had become a familiar routine for Bobby and his team. By this point, they had been coming to this same science building every day for a few months. It was a massive renovation project. Bobby and his crew were tasked with completely overhauling the entire building. This included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, the hallways, everything. It was a big job, and they still had a lot of work ahead of them before they would be finished. But there was another reason this job was taking so long. When Bobby's crew had first arrived at the building a couple of months ago, they had been told it would be completely prepped and ready for them. They expected an empty shell, a blank canvas for them to work on. They thought all the old furniture and equipment would have been cleared out. But when they walked in on that first day, they found the exact opposite. The place was a total mess. It was clear that the building hadn't been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, in particular, was a disaster zone. There were random glass flasks and beakers scattered everywhere. Old bottles of chemicals were left sitting on the countertops, some of them unlabeled. There were even wet, soiled rags with strange substances on them just left lying around the room. It was not a safe or efficient work environment. As a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a huge amount of cleanup work themselves before they could even start their actual jobs. It was work they hadn't planned for, and it really set them back on their schedule. And so now, just to try and catch up and stay on track, they were regularly putting in grueling 12-hour days almost every single day they were there. All of these extra hours had left Bobby feeling completely exhausted. Lately, he'd been feeling kind of sick, almost like he was coming down with something. He just chalked it up to being overworked. He figured his body was just protesting the long hours and physical labor. But Bobby wasn't the type to complain. The overtime pay was great, and that extra money would be a big help for his family. Plus, he genuinely enjoyed working with this particular crew. These guys weren't just his coworkers, they were his friends. So normally, even though the long workdays were exhausting and physically demanding, they were also kind of fun. They would joke around and keep each other's spirits up. Later that same afternoon, on August 19th, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside that same chemistry lab. He was up near the ceiling, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. As he was focused on his work, he suddenly heard a loud commotion coming from the other side of the room. It sounded like a bunch of guys from his crew shouting and laughing loudly. Curious, Bobby climbed down from his ladder to see what all the fuss was about. When he walked over, he saw that everyone was gathered in a circle around one of the other crew members, a guy named Sammy DePasquale. Sammy was doubled over, coughing and sputtering, and he was holding a can of Coke in his hand. Another member of the crew, a man named Robert Marinette, saw Bobby approaching and explained what had happened. Apparently, someone had played a prank on Sammy. They had swapped out his can of Coke with a different one, a can that was filled with disgusting chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. It was absolutely disgusting, a truly awful prank. But at the same time, it was also pretty typical for the guys on his crew. This is what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to lighten the mood and break up the monotony of the long workdays. And as Bobby looked around, he saw that everyone was laughing, including Sammy, the victim of the prank. So, after a moment, Bobby started laughing too. As gross as it was, he figured it was ultimately good for morale. After a minute or so, Sammy finally recovered from his coughing fit. He dramatically vowed to get payback on whoever had switched his Coke can, and then everyone got back to work. And so Bobby left the group and walked back over to his ladder. He started climbing back up to finish his wiring, but he paused about halfway up. A sudden wave of sickness washed over him. It felt like the flu was coming on fast and hard. This didn't really surprise him. He had been working all these overtime hours, and he had been feeling run down for a while now. So again, he just assumed this feeling was his body's way of telling him he was overworked. As Bobby stood there on the ladder, he told himself to just suck it up. He thought, this'll pass. He waited for a minute or two, and sure enough, the worst of the nausea did seem to fade away. Bobby was a hard-working guy, not a complainer. So he pushed the feeling of sickness out of his mind, climbed the rest of the way up the ladder, and got back to his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever before. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building, he felt like his feet were made of lead. Every step was an effort, and he was constantly short of breath. As the workday went on, while he was continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and hot. His body felt like it was burning up from the inside. His coworkers noticed. They could see he wasn't himself. They kept coming up to him, asking if he was okay, if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby felt awful and knew he probably should go home, he was stubborn. He would just tell them, "Nope, I'm just fine." And somehow he managed to push through the rest of the workday. At the end of the day, when it was finally time to go home, Bobby felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He couldn't wait to just get home, crawl into his bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, things had gotten much worse. That heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had transformed into an intense, burning pain that was now shooting all the way up his legs. And then, his hands went completely numb. He couldn't feel his own fingers. At this point, even Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not just a symptom of being overworked. Something was seriously wrong with him. So he went to see his doctor. But the doctor, after a brief examination, told him that despite his symptoms, it didn't seem to be anything too serious. He told Bobby that what he really needed was just to go home and get more rest. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all through the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lie in bed, hoping the rest would help. But by Sunday evening, Bobby still felt absolutely horrible. The rest wasn't working. So he picked up the phone and did something that he almost never did. He called one of his coworkers and told him that he wouldn't be able to come to work the next day. When Bobby woke up the next morning, Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife Joanne tried to help him get out of bed to go to the bathroom, but Bobby was a big guy and he was physically too heavy for her to lift on her own. So Joanne ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over to the house and help. But even with David there to help move Bobby around, it was very clear to everyone that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. This was serious, and it was not going away with rest like the doctor had said it would. At some point that day, the family decided they had no other choice. They called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. By the time they got to the emergency room, the pain in Bobby's legs had become so excruciating that he was periodically screaming out in agony. He had also started to vomit uncontrollably. After several hours of non-stop pain and a battery of tests at the hospital, the doctors finally came into Bobby's room. They told him and his family that they actually had some good news. They believed they knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a rare condition where the body's own immune system mistakenly attacks the nerves, causing symptoms like tingling and pain in the feet and hands. The hospital staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would start to feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved. So was his family. That day, he began taking the medication, and almost immediately, his pain became more tolerable. He stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough to be discharged and go home. It seemed like Bobby had turned a corner. It felt like everything was finally going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came roaring back, and this time, it was even worse than before. This was despite the fact that he was still taking the medication for Guillain-Barré syndrome. And then he began experiencing a terrifying new symptom. His hair started falling out in clumps. On September 7th, about a week and a half after he had first come back from the hospital, Bobby was right back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time his doctors seemed completely baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So, they had to admit that their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, even though the medication they had given him seemed to help for a little while. And so the problem now was that the doctors were basically at a total loss. They didn't know how to help Bobby. They simply had no idea what was going on with him. For the next 9 days, the doctors ran test after test. And all the while, Bobby's pain just intensified. It became so constant and so overwhelming that he fell into an almost delirious state. The pain was just completely too much for him to bear. And then, after all those days and all those tests, the doctors came back to Bobby and his family. They just told them that they didn't know what was wrong. All the tests had come back inconclusive, and they couldn't provide any clarity. And so, basically, they couldn't help him. They told Bobby that the only choice he had left was to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the large hospital in Hershey. He was on his way to the room where his new patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this new hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. The pain was driving him out of his mind. At one point, Bobby had even started throwing medical equipment across the room in a fit of agony and rage. And so now, for his own safety and the safety of the staff, Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. When Dr. Brennan reached Bobby's room, he took a deep breath out in the hallway and then walked inside. There, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, thrashing around violently and still screaming. Dr. Brennan felt awful about it. He felt terrible for Bobby, but he honestly didn't know what else to do for him. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to treat Bobby's pain, but absolutely nothing had worked. And so on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was to just stand there in Bobby's room feeling helpless as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent. Because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt a heavy sense of defeat as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. Inside, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family gathered around the bed. There was his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother, Mary. They had all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into the coma. Now, they all looked up at Dr. Brennan with expectant eyes, hoping for some good news. But Dr. Brennan took a deep breath and told them he had some bad news. New test results had finally come back. And now, based on those results, they finally knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. When he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of reaction, but they just stared at him blankly. They had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on to explain. He told them that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it's so potent that it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. He told them that this was highly unusual because thallium is a very controlled substance in the United States. It's actually banned in all household products. So this wasn't a chemical that Bobby could have just accidentally stumbled upon somewhere. This was extremely rare. At this point, Dr. Brennan paused to let the family process this new, horrifying information. The family members looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Nobody knew what to say. They just looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. When the doctor remained silent, Bobby's sister, Susan, finally asked in a quavering voice, "What can we do?" At that point, Dr. Brennan just slowly shook his head. He told them, "Unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning." 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital room. She looked at the medical staff who were gathered all around him, and she nodded. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But, with no hope of a cure and seeing the state he was in, Joanne had made the incredibly difficult decision that the kindest thing to do was to take him off life support. And so, after she gave the signal to the medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family stepped back from the bed. They watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then, Joanne had to watch as her husband of just over a year took his final, ragged breath. On the evening of the 21st of October 1991, about a month after Bobby had died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Cawley sat at a large table with 7 other men inside a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mix of coroners and investigators from all across the state. Some were from the Hershey area where Bobby had passed away. The rest, like Detective Cawley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre where Bobby had lived and gotten sick. The men were there to discuss the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had already been at it for the past 3 hours. There was just so much to talk about. They had already gone over Bobby's initial autopsy results, which were staggering. They showed that he had 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. Based on that number, they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium. Whether it was accidental or on purpose, they didn't know yet. And so they discussed theories for how this could have possibly happened to him. Remember, thallium isn't a chemical you can just buy at the store. It's highly regulated. So how did he come into contact with it? Their first thought was the most obvious one, the same thing everyone else suspected. Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. They had records from a preliminary examination of that lab. According to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They had also found a strange rag that was lying out on a countertop, a rag that was presumably there when Bobby and his crew first arrived and started cleaning everything up. And right next to this rag was a handwritten note with a chilling warning on it. It said, "Thallium wiping rag. Touch me and die." This rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic among the investigators when they had first gone in to sweep the lab. People were terrified that maybe they had brushed up against it, touched this rag, and were now at risk of thallium poisoning themselves. However, when they tested the rag, it came back negative for thallium. In fact, all the surfaces in the lab and even the air in the lab also tested negative. So the investigators had eventually decided that the note must have been some kind of a sick joke. On top of that, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for. They were adamant that none of it could have been stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know if any was missing. And so at this point, the university had been more or less ruled out as the place where Bobby was poisoned. This didn't really make sense to Detective Cawley or the other investigators at the dinner. Thallium is just so hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers, the guys who had worked in that same lab with him for so many days and hours. And every single one of them came back negative for thallium exposure. However, when they tested Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had both tested positive for thallium exposure. Now, it was on a near microscopic level. Any significant amount of exposure would have been lethal, and they were both okay. So they clearly hadn't received a lethal dose, but there were very small traces of thallium in both of their systems, which was extremely odd. And so everyone at the table agreed that the next logical step was to speak to Joanne. Maybe she had some idea of how she and her daughter, and by extension Bobby, could have come into contact with this very rare and very lethal chemical. They also knew they needed to get a search warrant for the family's duplex and search it from top to bottom for any signs of thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. After some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case, because that is where Bobby was actually poisoned. The very next day, Detective Cawley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Susan, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. and right away it was clear that both of them were extremely suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Colley that Joanne had been acting really strangely for months, both before and after Bobby's death. David said that when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him. She had called David to come over and look after Bobby, saying she needed someone strong enough to move him around, which was true. But while David was upstairs, literally carrying his brother to and from the bathroom, Joanne had stayed downstairs with her daughter and completely ignored them. She didn't even pretend that she wanted to help. She just let David do all the difficult work. And Susan added that even though she couldn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support was that she was hugely relieved. Colley listened and nodded, giving the impression that he understood and believed them. But on the inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was definite proof of suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, it was because Joanne had asked him to, after she had tried and failed to move her husband herself. And while David was there, she did have a 4-year-old daughter to look after. Maybe she couldn't just leave her unsupervised, or maybe she didn't want her young daughter to see her stepfather in such a terrible state. There were plausible explanations. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, well, everyone deals with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a truly traumatic, drawn-out process for everyone involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy he was gone. It could have just been relief that a nightmare chapter in all of their lives was finally over. And so after listening to their concerns, Colley began to redirect the conversation. He started asking David and Susan about their own relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They lived nearby and saw each other all the time. David, in particular, said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. They often went fishing together. And recently, they had worked together to completely renovate Bobby's kitchen. This detail caught Colley's attention. It sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project right around the same time that Bobby first started getting sick. Colley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he thanked David and Susan for the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of the 25th of October 1991, Detective Colley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station. Across from them sat Joanne Curley and a lawyer she had brought along with her. Colley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. On the one hand, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium. So that could mean they were all accidental victims, exposed to the same chemical source as Bobby, just on a much smaller scale. Or it could mean they were all targets of a poisoner who only succeeded in killing Bobby. Or Joanne could be the poisoner herself. Maybe she had poisoned her own husband and in the process accidentally exposed herself and her daughter to small amounts of the chemical. Basically, Colley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband had first gotten sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling run down for what felt like weeks, or maybe even months. But he hadn't had any major debilitating symptoms until that week before his first hospitalization in August. And she said that, much like Bobby himself, she had just chalked it all up to him being overworked. She thought maybe he had a standard illness that would just go away with rest, just like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium before, and at no point did it ever cross her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned. As Colley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with the investigators' initial assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had killed him. Based on what Joanne was saying, it seemed more likely that the poisoning had happened over a longer period of time. And the second thing that struck Colley was Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail the story of her husband dying an awful, agonizing death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she was describing it, she wasn't shedding a single tear. She wasn't acting at all like she was even upset about it. And so at this point, Collie was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about her. She really did not seem to care very much about her husband's death. So Collie stopped the other investigator. He leaned forward across the table and asked Joanne point blank, "How do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium?" And immediately, Joanne had a story ready. A very bizarre one. She said that Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from a big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. Bobby would take that thermos with him to work, drink the tea all day, and then come home with the thermos. She said that some days, when he would come back from work, he hadn't drunk all the iced tea. There would still be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said that what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea from the thermos and pour it back into the main pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage whatever was left. And she said that she and her daughter also drank from that same pitcher. So in essence, they were sometimes drinking the very same tea that Bobby had been drinking from all day. She suggested that perhaps if he was being exposed to thallium at work, maybe some of it was getting into the tea in his thermos. And then when she poured it back into the pitcher, she believed that was how she and her daughter were being exposed to small amounts of it. Collie glanced over at the other investigators in the room. They all looked as baffled as he felt. This iced tea explanation was pretty far-fetched, but it was so weirdly specific that they couldn't just write it off completely. And Collie knew that if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might actually explain why the three people in the family had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be getting a huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then just remnants of it were finding their way back into the leftover tea. So a very small amount of thallium was coming back home and getting mixed into the larger pitcher. When Joanne and her daughter drank from that pitcher, they would only be getting a very tiny dose. So again, it was an out there theory, but it could explain the facts. So Collie asked Joanne if he had her permission to not only search her whole duplex for thallium, but to specifically check her fridge, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby used to see if there were any trace levels of thallium inside them. He was worried that she might refuse or make an excuse. But Joanne immediately agreed, without any hesitation at all. That same afternoon, Collie, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curleys' duplex to begin their search. Collie watched as the crime scene unit, dressed in protective gear, entered the home and immediately began scouring every single surface. They tested everything, and they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos. The one Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would take to work and bring back every day. Traces of thallium were found on the little screw-top ridges at the top of the thermos, right where the lid would screw on. This was a huge break in the case. Not only because they now had the first clear sign of exactly where the thallium was entering Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was found at the top of the thermos, the part that his mouth would touch. This showed that the thallium wound up in Bobby's system because he ingested it, he drank it. That was something they hadn't known for sure up to this point. Now, it seemed very clear that's how it had happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium at all. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there in the first place. But for Collie, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item was something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe he and his team had been too quick to rule out Bobby's workplace. He was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had dismissed it as the place where he was poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another much closer look. 7 months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Collie sat at his desk, thumbing through a thick stack of notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was a great guy, well-liked, and nobody they knew would ever want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they liked to prank each other a lot, but they insisted the pranks were always harmless. They said spiking somebody's drink with a deadly chemical was way, way beyond anything they would ever do. At least, that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marinay, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner told Curley that those two had gotten the worst scores he had ever seen in his career. So, very quickly, those two shot to the top of Curley's suspect list. Curley pressed both of them hard, asking them if they had pranked Bobby by putting something in his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was. But they both said absolutely not. They didn't do that. But Curley didn't believe them. He'd already heard about their previous pranks, like swapping out drinks for tobacco spit. So it didn't seem like a huge leap to think they might have put something from the lab in Bobby's thermos as a joke. The problem was, Curley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Curley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was some unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove it. Curley also still felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also of Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne was still a suspect for obvious reasons. She had thallium in her system, she seemed oddly detached from Bobby while he was dying, and she was apparently relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And as for David, the reason he was on Curley's radar was because he had spent a lot of time alone with Bobby, and he had done that kitchen renovation with him right before he got sick. So, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby. But there was really no motive. And just like with Joanne, Curley kept coming back to the same question. Where would David even get the thallium? That was the big mystery. Where was the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Curley was basically at a dead end. He had a list of suspects, but no hard evidence against any of them. He just did not know how to move forward with the case. And this was heartbreaking, because earlier that same day, he had been informed that the district attorney had decided to officially shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was now officially cold. And since Curley couldn't revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Curley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Curley had been thinking a lot about this case recently. It had never sat right with him. And today, he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door. And once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Curley quickly explained why he was there. He told her there had been a technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Curley believed that the information they could get from this new test could help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news. She was about to open her mouth to reply, but Curley quickly added that there was a catch. He said that in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body. And the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Curley waited while Joanne processed everything he had just told her. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response in this moment would decide the entire fate of the case. If she said no, there was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever. Which meant that if someone had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was and the killer would never be brought to justice. But to Curley's relief, Joanne said, yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Curley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried. He watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled the casket out of the ground. The police and the coroner then took custody of Bobby's body and performed the new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Curley the exact information he had been hoping for. Based on the police investigation and, critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police now believe happened to Bobby Curley. The very first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice a thing, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer didn't hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, it would be enough to kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, the killer just added a little bit more the next time. And they just kept on doing that over and over again. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice the taste or get sick too quickly, and then they would get caught. So for months, Bobby was being slowly poisoned, but he didn't really show any significant symptoms, just that general feeling of being run down. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing those really severe symptoms. His legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer was certain they had finally finished him off. Except they hadn't. Because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So, the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital. And while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final, massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer casually encouraged him to drink the soda. And Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she finally murdered him. But investigators didn't realize this until that new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every single time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands became like timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Curley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October of 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out all the other suspects. The poisoning had simply started too early for his brother David to be responsible, and it had gone on for far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline pointed directly at Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they discovered that she had convinced Bobby to make her the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before she poisoned him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the wrongful death lawsuit of her first husband. Even though she acted like she was supportive of Bobby's dream to start his own business, she didn't want him to have any of that money. That was her money. And on top of that, by killing Bobby, she would also receive his life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would later admit that she had used an old container of rat poison. It was a brand that had been manufactured in the United States years ago before thallium was banned in household products. She had found it and held on to it. On the 12th of December 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne Curley was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years of that sentence and was released from prison in 2016. This case proves that sometimes a killer doesn't strike in a single moment, but slowly, patiently, right in front of everyone. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Bobby Curley case, make sure to leave your thoughts below and check out our other true crime stories linked on screen now. Until next time. Somewhere deep in a forest in France, a girl began to realize something was wrong. At first, it was just the sound of a bell ringing somewhere between the trees, and every time she stopped to listen, it would disappear like it was never there at all. But the deeper she went into the forest, the more certain she became of one thing. Something was there with her just out of sight. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella was finishing up her first year of college. She was excited to head home for the summer. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in France, a place tucked away in the mountains and almost completely surrounded by a massive, dense forest. Growing up there, Bella had spent a huge amount of her childhood exploring that forest. Sometimes she would go by herself, other times with her father, or maybe with her cousins. Over the years, she had come to know the woods like the back of her hand. She knew every trail, every landmark, every quiet little spot. Her absolute favorite place in this entire forest was a small, man-made lake that was situated deep inside, almost at the very center of the woods. It wasn't a very large lake, but the view was breathtaking and it was always incredibly peaceful. It was her go-to spot to clear her head. Getting there was a little ritual she had perfected over the years. She would leave her house, get into her small car, and drive for a couple of miles down a quiet country road. At a very specific, unmarked spot, she would pull over onto the gravel shoulder. There were no signs, no designated parking area. It was just a place she and her family had discovered, a hidden gateway to their part of the forest. After parking, she'd get out, and instead of walking along the road, she would turn and walk directly into the line of trees that grew right up against the shoulder. The underbrush was thick for the first few feet, but it quickly opened up into a small clearing. Just ahead, she would see a little stream trickling through the woods. To the left of this stream, there was what looked like a worn-out footpath, but it wasn't a human trail. It was an animal trail, a path carved out over years and years by deer and other wildlife making their way through the forest. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel to the stream. She'd walk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just enjoying the quiet sounds of nature, until the path took a sharp turn to the left, heading away from the water. At that point, Bella would leave the animal trail behind. She'd continue walking straight, following the stream north, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. This part of the journey involved stepping carefully on mossy rocks in the stream and walking along the muddy banks on either side. It was a slower pace, and it would take her about an hour of steady walking before the stream eventually met up with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, heading west, and follow the riverbank for another 20 minutes or so. And then, finally, the river would open up and feed directly into her destination, the man-made lake. She would find a comfortable rock to sit on, watch the animals, listen to the wind in the trees, and just feel totally at peace. To get back, she would just retrace her steps exactly. The whole trip, one way, from her car to the lake, took about 2 hours. A big part of why Bella loved this place so much was because it felt like it belonged to her and her family. In all her years of coming out here, the only other people she had ever seen in this part of the forest or anywhere near the lake were members of her own family. It was their secret, their private sanctuary. So, in June of that year, when Bella finally came home from college, one of the first things she wanted to do was go out to the lake. She hadn't been in months because of school, and she was really missing her happy place. One morning, she got up early, told her parents where she was headed, and set out by herself. She got in her car, drove the familiar couple of miles, and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. She got out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She found the stream, then the animal path beside it. She walked for a few minutes until the trail cut to the left, and just as she always did, she stayed with the stream, continuing her journey north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still a good mile or two away from the east-west river, she heard something. It was a bell. Somewhere off in the distance, far ahead of her, she heard a single, clear chime. As soon as she heard it, she stopped dead in her tracks. That was wrong. There were never any people out here. Ever. And that sound, a bell, had to come from a person or something a person had made. She stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if she had imagined it. It could have just been a strange sound, her mind playing tricks on her in the silence of the woods. She waited. And then she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a single chime. The bell started ringing continuously. It wasn't a steady, rhythmic ringing, though. It was sporadic and uneven, almost frantic, like someone holding a bell and just shaking it randomly at a sports game. Her mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a dog had gotten lost out here, and it had a bell on its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was too loud, too resonant. It wasn't the tiny jingle of a pet's bell. This was something bigger, more substantial. She thought of other, stranger possibilities. Maybe someone had a bell in a box, and the box fell into the river upstream and was now floating down, hitting rocks and causing the sound. She was coming up with all these weird scenarios, but honestly, she wasn't scared. She was just incredibly curious. Since the sound of the bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already heading, she decided to just keep walking. She wanted to see for herself what was making that noise. So Bella started walking along the stream again, her ears tuned to the constant random ringing up ahead. She was completely focused on it, trying to pinpoint its exact location. And then, after about 5 more minutes of walking, the bell just stopped. It went completely silent. The sudden absence of the sound was actually more startling than the sound itself. She stopped again, listening intently, expecting it to start up again, but it didn't. All she could hear now were the normal sounds of the forest, the stream, the birds, the wind. Bella had no explanation for the bell or why it had stopped, but she wasn't really worried about it. She figured there had to be a logical explanation for it, even if she couldn't think of one. So she just shrugged it off, put her focus back on her hike, and kept walking toward the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still making her way along the stream. She was getting closer to the east-west river, maybe only a half-mile away now. That's when she saw something up ahead on the left bank of the stream. It was a dark lump on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a strangely shaped rock or maybe an animal. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver lying motionless on the ground, and this beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a huge forest, and Bella knew perfectly well that it was full of wild animals. Finding the body of an animal that had been killed by a predator wasn't unusual. That was just nature. But as she stood over it, something struck her as deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was incredibly neat and uniform. It looked like its head had been very carefully removed with an extremely sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere in sight. This definitely didn't look like the work of a predator. The teeth and claws of an animal would have left a ragged, torn mess. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was completely untouched. Whatever had killed it clearly wasn't interested in eating it. As Bella stood there staring down at the bizarre sight, she also noticed there was no smell. Usually, when an animal dies, the process of decomposition starts quickly and it creates a very distinct odor. The lack of any smell told Bella that this beaver must have been killed very, very recently. Then she gently nudged the body with the toe of her shoe and saw that it was still fairly limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body that happens shortly after death, hadn't set in yet. As all these facts clicked into place in her mind, a cold realization washed over her. This beaver had died only a short time ago, which meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was probably still somewhere nearby. And then Bella couldn't help but connect the dead beaver to the bell she had heard earlier. Before, the bell was just a curiosity. But now, considering the sound had come from the same general area where this freshly killed and decapitated beaver was now lying, it made her deeply uneasy. Her head snapped up, and she found herself frantically scanning the trees, her eyes darting in every direction. She was looking for a person, maybe a hunter, someone who could explain what was going on. But she saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, just the dense, silent woods. She felt a wave of panic begin to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stop. She took a deep breath and told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods her entire life and had never seen another person, never had a dangerous encounter with an animal. She was sure everything was fine. She had to be overreacting. She had nothing to worry about. So, she took another deep breath, carefully stepped over the beaver's body, and kept on walking. Eventually, Bella reached the East-West River. She made the left turn and walked the final 20 minutes along its bank until she reached the man-made lake. She sat for a while, enjoying the beautiful view and the familiar scenery, trying to push the image of the beaver out of her mind. After some time, she got up, turned around, and began the long walk back. She passed the spot where the beaver was still lying on the ground, walked all the way back to her car, and went home, feeling a little unsettled, but mostly okay. A week went by. Bella was at home, feeling bored and restless. On an impulse, she decided that the only cure for her boredom was a trip back to the place she loved most, the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house. It was already 6 p.m. when she got in her car, drove to the pull-off, parked, and entered the woods. Sunset that night was at 9, so Bella knew she couldn't linger. This would have to be a quick trip if she wanted to avoid being caught in the forest after dark. She found the animal trail and started her journey along the stream. She followed it until the trail veered left, and then she continued along the stream bed. As she was walking, she started to hear the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the canopy of leaves and could see the sky was growing dark, much darker than it should be. It was still a couple of hours before sunset, so she knew a storm was rolling in. But Bella was determined. She was not going to turn back. She wanted to get to that lake. So instead of heading back to her car, she did the opposite. She started jogging along the stream, trying to get there as fast as she possibly could. Almost as soon as she picked up her pace, the first raindrops began to fall. By the time she passed the spot where the beaver corpse had been lying on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. About 15 minutes after she passed the corpse, she finally reached the East-West River. By this point, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Still, Bella was resolute. She turned left at the river and continued west, intending to go all the way to the lake. But after only a minute or two of walking along the river, with about 20 minutes still left to go, she stopped herself. She looked at her watch and saw that it was already after 8 o'clock. She started thinking it through logically. If she turned around right now, it would still take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9. It was already past 8. That meant, best case scenario, she was going to have to navigate the last part of her journey in the dark. And if she went all the way to the lake first, then she would be walking in the pitch black forest for maybe up to an hour. She was confident she could probably do it, but it was also pouring rain and she was cold and soaked. If she got lost or twisted an ankle, this could turn into a very bad situation very quickly. So, as much as she wanted to keep going, she made the sensible decision. She needed to turn around and head back. She turned and began walking back along the East-West River toward the spot where the stream fed into it. She turned south and started making her way along the stream back toward her car. Because it was getting so dark and the rain was so heavy, visibility was terrible. She kept her head down, watching the ground, trying not to trip. She was carefully placing her feet on rocks and muddy patches, making sure her footing was solid. The rain was pounding all around her. She had been walking like this for about 15 minutes when, all of a sudden, something hit her hard on the top of her head. Reflexively, she cried out and looked up, throwing her hands in front of her face to protect herself. And then she saw what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string, dangling from a tree branch directly over the path. And its head, which had been missing before, had been found. It had been crudely stitched onto the beaver's own front paws. So she was looking at this grotesque, dangling puppet of a beaver carrying its own head, and she had walked right into it. Her first reaction was to gag. She felt like she was going to vomit right there. She was so disgusted. Then she started frantically rubbing at her hair where the wet, decomposing thing had touched her, terrified that some fluid from it had gotten on her. After a moment of panicked scrubbing, she stopped. And something truly terrifying dawned on her. Whoever had strung this beaver up in this tree and had taken the time to stitch its head onto its paws had done it in the last 30 minutes. Because just 30 minutes earlier, on her way in, she specifically remembered seeing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It was in the same spot it had been a week ago. And now, here it was, hanging from a tree. As the wheels turned in her head, Bella came to a chilling conclusion. If someone had just done this, then that someone was probably still here. They were probably nearby. At this point, it was getting really dark. The rain was hammering down, and she felt completely exposed. She started whipping her head around, trying to peer through the downpour into the dark woods, searching for anyone who might have done this. But all she could see was the dark, blurry shape of the forest in every direction. She knew she was at least an hour away from her car, even if she ran. Suddenly, she was totally and completely panicked. In a desperate effort to calm herself down, she whispered to herself, "Okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running, I'll fall, I'll get lost, this will turn into a nightmare. Just walk. Try to walk." So she took a shaky breath, walked around the dangling beaver corpse, and started moving along the stream again. But as soon as she was past it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear movement behind her. A rustling sound. She didn't know what it was. It could have been a deer, just some animal startled by the storm. But she was far too afraid to turn around and look. And even though she was telling herself to stay calm, to just keep walking, that she was safe and just freaking herself out, she could feel her pace quickening. Her walk turned into a jog, and then finally she broke into a full-on sprint, running down the stream away from that beaver and whatever was moving in the trees behind her. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing the beaver, she was so out of breath from sprinting that she had to slow down to a walk. As soon as she slowed down, still without turning around, she heard it again. The sound of that bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that constant, sporadic ringing. But in her panic state, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her anxiety was so high, her heart was pounding so loud, she didn't know if it was behind her, or to the side, or all around her. It was now completely dark, and she was full-blown terrified. There was someone or something behind her, the person who had strung up that beaver, and they were probably watching her right now. Even though she was beyond exhausted and could barely breathe, she started sprinting again as fast as her legs would carry her. She stumbled and fell on the slippery rocks. She tripped over roots, not even looking where she was going anymore. And in the background, all around her, she could hear that bell chiming, and she could hear something crashing through the woods behind her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. As she was running, she managed to dial her father. She pressed the phone to her ear, crying, panting, gasping for air. Her father picked up, and she was so relieved to hear his voice, but she couldn't even form a sentence. She just started wailing, pleading with him. "Dad, come out to the forest! Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest, they're chasing me, and I can't see them." Her father, on the other end of the line, didn't know what to make of it, but he could hear the pure primal fear in his daughter's voice. He didn't waste time with questions. He just said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." Bella's father and mother, with Bella still on the phone with them, ran out of their house. They jumped in their car and sped the couple of miles down the road. They parked next to their daughter's car, and as they were getting out, they could hear it. Way off in the woods, they could hear the faint sound of the bell. They could hear their daughter screaming on the phone, and they could hear that same bell sound coming through the phone's speaker. She was begging them, "Please, come into the woods, come in here, save me." Her parents ran into the woods and started charging up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella was still deep in the forest, still 10 or 15 minutes away from them. She could barely run anymore. She had used up almost all of her energy. And as she got closer and closer to where her parents would be, the sporadic ringing of the bell was getting louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was gaining on her. She could hear sticks and branches snapping right behind her, as if something was just feet away. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right behind her head, she just stopped. It was a moment of complete defeat. She was too far away from her parents. She wasn't going to make it to them in time. It was almost as if she felt she had no choice but to turn around and finally see whatever it was that was hunting her. So, terrified beyond words, so scared and so tired she could barely breathe, Bella slowly turned around. When she turned, she found herself facing a small clearing she had just run past. Because it was a clearing, a little bit of moonlight was able to filter down through the trees, just enough to illuminate the space, which was about 50 feet across. As she looked across this clearing, at first she saw nothing. And then a tall, dark figure walked into the clearing from the trees on the other side. As soon as it stepped into the faint light, she could see it had a bell tied at its waist. With every single step it took, its leg would strike the bell, causing that violent ringing sound. This thing started moving across the clearing, and as Bella stared at it, it was like time slowed down. She couldn't process what she was seeing. She didn't know what it was. All she knew was that whatever or whoever this was, it was coming straight for her. And then, suddenly, Bella felt an unbelievable rush of adrenaline. It was like her body went into autopilot, a pure survival instinct. She turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her entire life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now understood was the sound of its steps. The bell was getting faster and faster, louder and louder. She knew it was gaining on her. She started screaming out loud, lying, "I'm on the phone with the police! They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any second." But whatever was behind her wasn't fazed. It just kept charging forward, closing the distance second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot. But her father couldn't just stand there and wait. He started charging deeper into the woods towards the sounds. He could hear his daughter's screams, he could hear the bell getting louder and louder, and he just ran straight towards it. And sure enough, just seconds later, he saw his daughter compounding out of the dark forest. She saw him and leaped into his arms. He grabbed her, turned around, and ran with her back to the meeting spot. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them just charged out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back into their car. And they sped away. In the car, all of them were crying. They had no idea what to make of what had just happened. Bella was trying to describe what she saw, but she couldn't get the words out. Her parents had been on the phone listening to their daughter's terrified screams, and all they kept saying to each other was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell." That sound confirmed their worst nightmares. There really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to harm their child. They drove straight to the police station, where Bella filed a report about everything she had experienced in the forest. Afterwards, as a precaution, her parents took her to the hospital. She was determined to be physically okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling. The following morning, the police went out to the forest. They went to the area Bella had described and conducted a thorough search all along the animal trail and the stream. But they never found any sign of this tall, dark figure with the bell. Bella had told the police that she was carrying a handbag and that she had dropped it while she was running. She remembered exactly where along the stream she had dropped it, but when the police searched that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It wasn't tied to the tree, and it wasn't on the ground. It had vanished. The only thing the police found that was out of the ordinary was a t-shirt. A little ways off from the stream, basically along the path Bella would have been running, they found a t-shirt that was neatly folded and placed carefully underneath a rock. But the police, Bella and her family, had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she had run into was some kind of mentally unstable person who was living out in the woods. Perhaps when Bella came into the forest, this person felt like she was trespassing on their property, and so they tried to scare her away. But Bella has a very hard time accepting that explanation. She felt with every fiber of her being that as she was running from whoever was behind her, she was in mortal danger. She believes that if her father hadn't run into the woods and literally grabbed her and carried her the rest of the way, she might not have gotten out of there at all. She might have been attacked and killed by whatever that was. And when she looks back on the experience, she can't help but think about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing. When she saw that figure step into the moonlight for the first time, she remembers that the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal. They were abnormal, disjointed. There was something so off about its movement that for a second, it didn't even seem like she was looking at a person, but maybe some kind of large animal. Since her ordeal, there have been no other strange sightings reported in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. The police never found anyone or anything in that forest. No trace of the shadow. No trace of the beaver. Nothing. It's just an empty forest and the sound of a bell that no one can fully explain. To this day, Bella and her family refuse to ever go near that forest again, because anything out there has never proven that it has left. Deep in the rugged terrain of the Sierra Madre Oriental, a mountain range stretching hundreds of miles south of the Texas-Mexico border, lay a region forgotten by time. Nestled at the foot of these towering peaks, about halfway down the mountain chain, were several tiny isolated villages. The people who lived there were desperately poor, entirely illiterate, and largely cut off from the modern world. In May of 1963, this profound isolation became the breeding ground for a nightmare that would shock the world. It began with a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero. Sebastian lived in one of these remote villages and frequently spent his evenings walking up the steep mountainside. Local folklore rumored that the numerous caves cutting into the eastern face of the peaks held hidden treasures. Whether Sebastian truly believed the legends or simply craved adventure, he found himself trekking up the mountain path late one night. He had no flashlight, navigating the familiar, dark trails entirely by memory. As he walked, Sebastian noticed something unusual far to his right. A steady glow was emanating from the massive mouth of one of the caves. It was a strange sight. The villagers never ventured into the caves, especially not after dark. Intrigued, Sebastian abandoned his original route and angled his path toward the light. The further he walked from his village, the more the silence of the night was replaced by a disturbing sound echoing from the cavern. At first, it sounded like distant laughter or a raucous party, but as he drew closer, the noise sharpened into a chilling sound, a human being screaming in agonizing pain and terror. Anxiety gripped the teenager, but curiosity pushed him forward. Soon, he could distinguish other voices. Beneath the frantic screams, a large group of people was chanting and singing in an eerie, unified drone. Trembling, Sebastian approached within 10 feet of the 10-foot-wide opening and hid behind a large boulder. Summoning his courage, he took a deep breath and peeked around the edge of the rock into the illuminated cave. The horror of what he saw froze him in place. Inside, bathed in the flickering light of fires, a human sacrifice was taking place. Before he could fully process the gruesome spectacle, his survival instincts kicked in. Sebastian turned and bolted down the mountain, fueled by absolute panic. Terrified that someone might be pursuing him, he didn't dare stop at his own village. Instead, he ran nearly 10 miles to the nearest town with a police station. He burst through the station doors, drenched in sweat and hysterical. The startled officers tried to calm him down, but the sheer horror of the event had stripped Sebastian of his vocabulary. Struggling to explain the unexplainable, he told the police that he had just seen vampires cutting a person apart in the cave. Hearing a frantic boy babble about monsters, the officers dismissed his story as a childhood nightmare. They calmed him down, promised to look into any unusual reports, and drove him back to his village. The next morning, Sebastian still couldn't shake the terrifying imagery. He ran back to the police station, begging them to believe him. Moved by the boy's relentless panic, an officer named Luis Martinez agreed to investigate. The two hopped into a police car and drove toward the mountains. By late afternoon, the police station realized Officer Martinez had not checked in via radio and was long overdue. As evening fell and repeated radio calls went unanswered, a search party headed to Sebastian's village. There, the boy's family revealed that neither Sebastian nor the officer had returned. Realizing they were facing a critical emergency, the understaffed local police contacted the Mexican army for assistance. A military unit was dispatched, and later that night, heavily armed soldiers and police officers moved up the mountain toward the cave. What they ultimately discovered was a horror story 6 months in the making. The nightmare had actually begun in December of 1962 when two grifter brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, arrived in the area. The brothers made a living swindling vulnerable people across Mexico, and they had engineered a grand scheme to exploit an entire community. They targeted La Yerba Buena, a village of about 20 deeply superstitious and illiterate families living just beneath the caves. Strolling into town, the charismatic brothers put on a dramatic performance, declaring themselves the chosen prophets of an ancient, exiled Incan god. They promised the villagers unimaginable wealth if they obeyed their commands. Uneducated and desperate for a better life, the villagers believed them, effectively becoming the brothers' slaves and giving up what little possessions they had. By early 1963, however, the villagers grew restless. They were being severely mistreated, and the promised riches never materialized. Sensing the growing dissent, the Hernandez brothers traveled to a nearby city to recruit reinforcements. They hired Magdalena Solis, a young prostitute who had known nothing but abuse and powerlessness her entire life, along with her brother and pimp, Eleazar. The plan was simple. Magdalena would pose as a reincarnated Incan goddess to terrify the villagers back into submission. The brothers smuggled Magdalena into the cave, dressed her in an elaborate exotic costume, and hid her behind a makeshift smokescreen created with basic magic tricks. They then marched the villagers up to the cavern. On cue, Magdalena leaped through the billowing smoke, fiercely proclaiming her divine status and threatening to strike down anyone who disobeyed. The theatrical display completely overwhelmed the villagers. Their doubts vanished instantly. However, the con artists failed to anticipate the psychological impact the event would have on Magdalena. Looking out at the awe and absolute reverence in the villagers' eyes, something snapped inside her mind. A woman who had been exploited her whole life suddenly held absolute power over an entire community. She began to genuinely believe her own lie. Within days, Magdalena violently seized control of the cult, demoting the Hernandez brothers to mere enforcers. Her delusions rapidly worsened. She convinced herself that to sustain her divine immortality, she required blood. At first, she demanded animal blood, forcing the villagers to slaughter their livestock and pets. But the cult took a lethal turn in April when two villagers attempted to escape the madness. The Hernandez brothers discovered the plot and informed Magdalena, who immediately summoned the entire village to the cave. In front of the congregation, Magdalena pointed at the two dissenters and ordered the crowd to kill them. Driven by fanaticism and fear, the villagers attacked their neighbors, beating them to death. Magdalena had their bodies strung up on pikes. She filled a chalice with their spilling blood and drank it. At that moment, her delusion evolved. Animal blood was no longer enough. She required human sacrifices. Over the next 6 weeks, a reign of terror enveloped the mountain. Periodically, Magdalena would call the villagers into the dark cave. No one knew who the next victim would be. Standing before the terrified crowd, she would select a sacrifice, and the victim's own friends and family would look on or assist out of sheer self-preservation. Worse still, Magdalena decided that beating the victims to death spoiled the blood. She ordered the villagers to beat the chosen targets into submission and string them up alive, allowing her to carve their hearts out while they were still breathing. This was the horrific ritual Sebastian had witnessed that night in May. When he returned the next day with Officer Luis Martinez, the cult ambushed them. Both the boy and the policeman were dragged into the depths of the cave, where they were ritualistically murdered, their hearts cut out by Magdalena. When the army and police finally reached the area, they found La Yerba Buena completely deserted. The villagers had barricaded themselves inside the cave with weapons, prepared to fight to the death for their goddess. A violent shootout erupted between the authorities, the fanatical villagers, and the Hernandez brothers. By the time the gunfire ceased, the majority of the cult members, including both Hernandez brothers, were dead. Entering the bloody cavern, the authorities discovered the horrific pikes and scattered human remains. A search of a nearby shack in the village led to the arrest of Magdalena and Eliezer Solis, who were hiding in the shadows. It was estimated that Magdalena had sacrificed at least 15 people, though only the remains of Sebastian and Officer Martinez could be positively identified. Magdalena and her brother were sentenced to 50 years in prison, while the surviving villagers received 30 years for their roles in the murders and the shootout. Proving the absolute power of the psychological programming, none of the surviving villagers ever testified against Magdalena, choosing decades in prison over betraying the woman they still feared as a cosmic deity. Magdalena Solis eventually died behind bars, leaving behind one of the darkest legacies of psychological manipulation and madness in history. The historical Inca mix-up. To truly comprehend how two traveling con artists could convince an entire Mexican village that they were the chosen prophets of an ancient Incan deity, one must examine the profound intellectual and geographical vacuum that existed in the remote corners of the Sierra Madre Oriental in 1962. When Santos and Cayetano Hernandez concocted their elaborate scheme to rob the village of La Yerba Buena, they chose a lie that was historically and geographically absurd. Yet, the success of their deception highlights a fascinating, tragic intersection of total isolation, absolute illiteracy, and human vulnerability. From a historical and geographical standpoint, the premise of the Hernandez brothers' scam was fundamentally flawed. The Inca Empire was an ancient civilization that flourished in the Andean region of South America, centered in modern-day Peru and stretching across parts of Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Culturally, structurally, and linguistically, the Incas were completely distinct from the indigenous civilizations of Mesoamerica. Mexico was historically the cradle of legendary empires like the Aztecs, the Maya, the Zapotecs, and the Mixtecs. To anyone with even a rudimentary education, preaching about the return of an Incan god in the northern mountains of Mexico would be the equivalent of trying to convince a European village that the ancient emperors of Japan had returned to claim a British hillside. The two worlds were separated by thousands of miles of dense rainforests, treacherous oceans, and entirely different historical timeline. However, the Hernandez brothers were shrewd sociopaths who understood their target audience perfectly. They did not choose a major cultural center or a bustling city for their heist. They specifically sought out a community where the modern world simply did not exist. La Yerba Buena was a tiny settlement consisting of roughly 20 families. It was deeply tucked away at the foot of an imposing mountain range, lacking roads, electricity, televisions, newspapers, or schools. The inhabitants were entirely illiterate, living a harsh hand-to-mouth existence as subsistence farmers. Their world was bounded by the peaks above them and the soil beneath their feet. They had never seen a map of the world, nor did they possess any concept of continental geography. They did not know where Peru was, nor did they know that Mexico was an independent nation with its own distinct history. To the people of La Yerba Buena, the past was a vague tapestry of old legends, and the world outside their valley was an incomprehensible expanse. When Santos and Cayetano walked into the village, they did not just tell a story. They put on a masterclass in psychological manipulation. They used the villagers' total lack of historical context to their advantage. To a population completely cut off from education, the word Inca carried no specific geographical anchor. It was merely a word that sounded ancient, powerful, and deeply spiritual. The brothers spoke with absolute confidence, painting vivid pictures of an exiled, vengeful god who demanded obedience but promised unimaginable wealth in return. The villagers had no reference books, no teachers, and no memories of the outside world to challenge this narrative. To them, an ancient indigenous god was simply an ancient god. The distinction between the gods of the Andes and the gods of Mesoamerica meant nothing because both were entirely outside their daily reality of poverty and survival. The psychological trap was sprung even tighter when the brothers introduced Magdalena Solis into the equation. Sensing that the villagers were beginning to doubt the promises of wealth, the brothers knew they needed an undeniable manifestation of their lie. They brought Magdalena to the deep, dark cavern on the mountainside and dressed her in an exotic costume meant to evoke a divine, royal presence. When the villagers were led into the cave, the environment itself worked against their senses. The vast, echoing darkness, illuminated only by flickering fires, created an atmosphere of primal dread and reverence. The brothers then deployed basic magic tricks, igniting chemicals to produce a thick, billowing smoke screen that rolled across the cavern floor. When Magdalena leaped through the smoke, declaring herself to be the reincarnated Incan goddess, the sensory overload was complete. For an uneducated person who had never seen special effects, theater, or modern entertainment, this was not a performance. It was a terrifying disruption of reality. The smoke, the fire, the booming echoes, and the commanding presence of a woman claiming divine status were all the proof the villagers needed. The theatrical display bypassed any need for logic or historical accuracy. The sheer terror and awe inspired by the spectacle solidified the delusion in the minds of the villagers, effectively shutting down any lingering capacity for skepticism. This profound historical mix-up demonstrates how easily isolated human minds can be hijacked when they are denied access to basic knowledge. The Hernandez brothers managed to transplant an entire South American mythology into a remote Mexican valley purely because their victims lacked the educational tools to question the geography of the lie. The tragedy of La Yerba Buena proves that when people are left in absolute isolation, the boundaries between truth and fiction disappear entirely. The terrifying theatrics in the cave became their new reality, and a misplaced South American deity became the catalyst for an authentic, bloody nightmare in the heart of Mexico. The blood rituals and folia pluzurs. The descent of La Yerba Buena from a peaceful, isolated Mexican village into a blood-soaked sanctuary of human sacrifice is a chilling exploration of one of the rarest and most terrifying phenomena in psychiatric history. Folia pluzurs, or the madness of many. What began as a financial scam orchestrated by two opportunistic con artists quickly transformed into a shared, infectious psychosis that gripped an entire community. As Magdalena Solis truly began to believe her own lie, her escalating delusions of grandeur and immortality systematically infected the minds of her followers, turning a group of impoverished, illiterate farmers into a unified weapon of slaughter. Under the influence of this shared madness, the traditional bonds of family, friendship, and basic human morality were completely erased, replaced by a frantic, survival-driven fanaticism that demanded the blood of their own neighbors. The psychological foundation for this mass hysteria was laid long before the first drop of human blood was spilled. The residents of La Yerba Buena lived in absolute physical and cultural isolation at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental. Cut off from the outside world, without education, and facing the constant anxiety of extreme poverty, the community was a highly suggestible collective mind. When Magdalena Solis was presented to them as a reincarnated deity through theatrical smoke and fire, she filled a deep spiritual void. For the villagers, her presence meant they were no longer forgotten, invisible people. They were the chosen subjects of a living goddess. When Magdalena's mind fractured and she genuinely adopted the identity of a vengeful Incan deity, the villagers did not see a woman losing her sanity. They saw the terrifying absolute certainty of a god. Because they lacked any external reality check, Magdalena's personal psychosis became the unquestioned framework of their entire existence. The true nightmare began when Magdalena's delusions evolved from a craving for power into an insatiable demand for blood. Convinced that she required a life force to sustain her divine immortality, she initially ordered the villagers to sacrifice their farm animals and household pets. This was the first critical step in breaking down the community's moral boundaries. By forcing the farmers to slaughter the animals that represented their livelihoods and companionship, Magdalena tested their obedience and desensitized them to violence. Night after night, the village echoed with the cries of dying livestock, and the smell of blood became a permanent fixture of their environment. The villagers willingly complied out of a deeply ingrained fear of divine retribution. In their shared psychological reality, keeping the goddess alive and happy was the only thing standing between them and cosmic destruction. However, a shared psychosis is a progressive disease that requires increasingly extreme stimuli to maintain its hold. The boundary between animal sacrifice and human slaughter was crossed in April of 1963 when two villagers attempted to break free from the cult's tightening grip. When the Hernandez brothers discovered the escape plot and informed Magdalena, her response was swift and calculated. She summoned the entire congregation to the dark, cavernous depths of the mountain. In that enclosed, echo-filled space, surrounded by the oppressive atmosphere of religious fervor, Magdalena pointed her finger at the two dissenters and branded them as heretics who threatened the survival of the entire community. She did not execute them herself. Instead, she commanded the crowd to destroy them. It was at this precise moment that folia pluzurs manifested in its most destructive form. In a healthy society, a crowd confronted with such a command would experience a crisis of conscience. But inside the cave of La Yerba Buena, the collective mind had completely fused with Magdalena's will. The fear of being perceived as unfaithful, combined with the intense peer pressure of a small group, triggered a stampede of violence. Neighbors who had lived alongside the dissenters for decades, friends who had shared meals with them, suddenly launched themselves at the victims. The crowd beat and stomped the two individuals to death in a frenzy of shared rage and terror. By participating collectively in the murder, the guilt was distributed among everyone in the room, binding them together in a pact of blood and silence. The psychological transformation was completed when Magdalena had the bodies strung up on pikes, caught their spilling blood in a chalice, and drank it before her cheering followers. In her shattered mind, this act of cannibalism elevated her to a new spiritual plane. She announced to the village that animal blood was no longer sufficient. Her divinity could now only be sustained by human sacrifices. Because the villagers had already crossed the line into homicide, their minds rationalized this new rule as a necessary continuation of their faith. The shared delusion had created an entirely new moral code. Killing was no longer a sin, it was a holy duty required to protect the village from the wrath of their goddess. For the next 6 weeks, the cave became an assembly line of ritualistic murder. The mechanics of these sacrifices were designed to reinforce Magdalena's absolute control and maximize the psychological terror that fueled the shared madness. Periodically, the village would be marched up the mountain for a blood ritual. The true horror of these gatherings lay in the absolute uncertainty of who would be chosen. The villagers would stand in the dimly lit cavern, sweating and trembling, as Magdalena slowly walked through the crowd, inspecting them like cattle. When her gaze finally settled on a victim, the psychological mechanism of folie à plusieurs would instantly activate. Out of an overwhelming dread for their own lives, the surrounding crowd, including the chosen victim's own parents, siblings, or children, would immediately attack the target. The human instinct to protect one's family was entirely overwritten by the primal urge to survive and conform to the group. To hesitate, to show pity, or to cry out in protest was to signal to Magdalena that you were a doubter, which would instantly make you the next sacrifice on the pikes. Therefore, fathers helped pin down their sons, and mothers watched in fanatical silence as their daughters were subdued. The shared madness acted as a psychological armor, shielding the villagers from the horrific reality of what they were doing by reframing the atrocity as an act of cosmic necessity. As the weeks wore on, the psychosis demanded even greater levels of cruelty. Magdalena convinced herself that beating the victims to death before consuming their blood somehow spoiled its divine potency. She altered the ritual, ordering the villagers to beat the sacrifices only until they were submissive, and then string them up on the wooden pikes while they were still fully conscious. With the victim hanging alive before the silent, staring eyes of the entire community, Magdalena would step forward with a sharp blade and carve their heart out of their chest, catching the arterial spray in her chalice. The villagers did not run, they did not riot. Instead, they watched the horrific spectacle in a state of trance-like awe, chanting and singing in unison to drown out the screams of the dying. The rhythmic, repetitive chanting served as a hypnotic tool, further locking their minds into the collective hysteria and numbing their individual consciousness. By the time the Mexican authorities discovered the cult in May of 1963, the folie à plusieurs had completely consumed the remaining population of La Yerba Buena. When the army and police approached the mountain, the villagers did not welcome them as liberators from a monstrous tyrant. Instead, because their minds were entirely trapped within the shared delusion, they viewed the authorities as demonic invaders trying to destroy their living goddess. They willingly barricaded themselves inside the cave, picking up firearms and machetes to engage in a suicidal shootout against heavily armed soldiers. They fought with the fanatical bravery that only a shared psychosis can provide, resulting in the deaths of the majority of the villagers. Even after Magdalena Solis was arrested and her identity as a mortal fraud was exposed to the world, the psychological conditioning of the surviving cult members remained unbroken. During their trials, despite facing 3 decades in a harsh prison system and being offered reduced sentences in exchange for information, not a single villager would testify against Magdalena or her brother. The shared madness had permanently altered the structure of their minds. Even in handcuffs, looking at the ordinary woman who had orchestrated the murder of their families, the survivors still saw the terrifying majesty of an Incan goddess. They chose a lifetime behind bars over the unthinkable sin of betraying the deity of the cave, leaving behind a grim testament to the absolute devastating power of a shared human madness. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the southeastern part of Australia, in a region known for its sprawling farmland and unique geological formations, there is a small hole in the ground that looks completely harmless. It sits right in the middle of a wide, grassy field where sheep and cows often graze. If you were walking through this pasture, you would probably step right over it without second thought. But this tiny opening is actually the entrance to one of the most beautiful, pristine, and incredibly deadly places on the planet. Over the years, this small hole in the dirt has claimed the lives of at least 16 people. Today, I am going to tell you the story of what lies beneath that field and the tragic events that unfolded there on a sunny day in 1973. To understand how this place was found, we have to go back to the year 1938. At the time, a local farmer was working on his large property in the southeastern Australian countryside. It was a typical warm day, and the farmer decided to lead his horses across his land to a watering hole on the other side of the property. As he was walking his horses through a large, flat pasture, one of his horses suddenly stumbled and collapsed to the ground. The farmer was startled and ran over to see what had happened to the animal, thinking it might have suffered a serious injury. But as soon as he reached the horse, the animal stood right back up. It shook off the dust, looked around, and seemed to be completely unhurt. The farmer was very confused. He had no idea why a perfectly healthy, strong horse would suddenly collapse like that in the middle of an open field. He figured the horse must have tripped on something hidden in the grass, so he began searching the ground where the horse had fallen. He moved the horse out of the way and looked closely at the dirt. That was when he saw a small opening in the ground. He got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look. The opening was quite small, only about a foot across, and it was surrounded by grass and soil. But when the farmer leaned over and peered down into the darkness, he realized it was incredibly deep. He waited a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim light, and when they did, he saw something that completely shocked him. About 10 or 15 feet below the dry, dusty surface of his pasture, there was a large, perfectly still pool of crystal clear water. It turned out that the horse had stepped directly onto the thin limestone roof of a massive, hidden underground cave. The farmer was absolutely fascinated by what he had found. He had lived on this land for years and had no idea there was a giant body of water sitting right beneath his feet. He wanted to know how deep this water went and how large the cave actually was. So he led his horses back to the stable to keep them safe, and he grabbed a long, heavy measuring rope with a lead weight tied to the end of it. He ran back out to the middle of the field, knelt by the small opening, and dropped the heavy weight into the hole. He began paying out the rope, letting it slide through his fingers yard by yard. Down it went. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet. The rope just kept disappearing into the dark opening, showing no signs of stopping. The farmer watched in absolute amazement as the rope continued to run out. Finally, after letting out a massive amount of line, the weight hit something solid. The rope went slack. The farmer checked his marks on the rope and saw that the weight had stopped at exactly 120 feet. He was blown away by this. He thought to himself that a cave over 100 feet deep was an incredible discovery, and he believed he had reached the very bottom. He pulled the rope back up and went home, eager to tell people about the massive underground well on his property. But the problem was, the farmer had not actually reached the bottom of the cave at all. The heavy weight on his line had only touched the very top of a massive underwater structure. In reality, the water extended down almost 300 additional feet past that point. The farmer and his horse had accidentally discovered one of the deepest, most beautiful, and most dangerous freshwater caves in the world. This place would eventually become known to divers simply as the Shaft. The reason it is called the Shaft is because of its highly unusual layout. The only way in or out of this massive underground water system is through that very same tiny 1-foot hole in the middle of the open field. It is literally a vertical shaft of rock that drops straight down for 18 feet from the surface of the grass until it reaches the water below. Because the opening is so incredibly narrow, cave divers cannot enter the cave with their gear on. It is physically impossible to fit through the hole while wearing scuba tanks and a buoyancy compensator. So, the process of getting into the cave is extremely complicated and physically demanding. The divers have to be harnessed up and lowered down into the dark hole one by one, completely on their own without any of their equipment. They dangle on a rope and are lowered down into the damp darkness until they splash into the cold water below. Once they are floating in the water, their heavy diving gear is lowered down to them on a separate line. The divers then have to tread water in the dark, grabbing their heavy tanks and gear out of the water and put everything on while they are floating. It is an exhausting process before the dive even officially begins. Now, remember when the farmer dropped his weighted line and it hit solid land at 120 feet, what his weight had actually touched was the top of something that divers call the rock pile. The rock pile is a massive underwater mountain made of giant boulders and rocks that sits directly in the middle of this huge cavern. It looks like a giant pyramid rising up from the deep. From the top of this rock pile, a diver can swim down in almost any direction. But once you reach the base of this underwater mountain, there are only two main tunnels that lead deeper into the earth. The first tunnel goes to the west. It slopes down at a gradual angle and eventually ends in a complete dead end at about 260 feet deep. On the other side of the rock pile is the eastern tunnel. This tunnel is much more famous and much more treacherous. It goes down at a very steep, aggressive angle, plunging down into the earth until it reaches a depth of 400 feet. The few elite divers who have ever explored the deepest parts of this cave say that the shaft is divided into three very distinct stages. Stage 1 is the easiest part of the cave. It starts at the water's surface and goes down to 120 feet, which is the top of the rock pile. During this first stage, the water is unbelievably clear. Because the water is so pure and untouched, the sunlight from the small hole in the field shines straight down through the water, creating beautiful, shimmering beams of blue light. It feels like you are floating in a massive, sunlit cathedral. It is a very simple and straightforward dive, and there is a permanent safety line that is anchored from the surface of the water straight down to the top of the rock pile. This gives divers a physical line to hold onto as they make their descent and ascent. But once you pass the top of the rock pile, you enter stage 2, and this is where things get extremely dangerous. Stage 2 begins at 120 feet and goes down to either the end of the western tunnel at 260 feet or down to the 200-foot mark of the eastern tunnel. At the 200-foot mark of the eastern tunnel, you reach a physical feature called the drop-off ledge. This is a literal cliff edge inside the tunnel, and beyond it, the cave drops off into a massive, deep abyss. As soon as you enter stage 2, you are completely on your own. The safety line from the surface ends at the top of the rock pile, so there is no line to guide you down the slopes of the underwater mountain. You have to navigate completely on your own. And as you swim down into the tunnels, the natural sunlight begins to fade very quickly. The sun's rays simply cannot penetrate the deep, curving tunnels of the cave. The water gets darker and darker until you are completely dependent on your flashlight. But the problem is, the walls of these tunnels are covered in a very thick layer of limestone silt. This silt is like a fine white powder. If a diver accidentally bumps into the wall with their shoulder, or if they kick their fins too hard and disturb the water near the rocks, that silt will immediately slide off and mix with the water. It creates a massive, blinding cloud. It is like driving a car into a thick fog bank, except your headlights just reflect off the white particles, making it impossible to see even an inch in front of your face. When a silt out happens, you are completely blinded. You have to either sit completely still and wait for hours for the silt to settle, or you have to try to swim out completely blind, which often leads to panic and death. But the silt is not the only danger in Stage 2. Anyone who enters Stage 2 or Stage 3 cannot breathe regular air from their scuba tanks. Regular air is made up of about 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. When you breathe regular air at great depths, the high water pressure forces the nitrogen to dissolve directly into your bloodstream and your tissues. This causes a condition known as nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen narcosis affects your brain in a way that is very similar to alcohol. It makes you feel incredibly drunk, euphoric, and totally relaxed. Your decision-making skills completely disappear. In extreme cases of nitrogen narcosis, divers have been known to do completely insane things. Some divers have taken their mouthpieces out and tried to hand them to fish, or they have inhaled water because they genuinely believed they were standing on dry land. Other divers get so confused that they lose their sense of up and down, and they will swim straight down into the deep, thinking they are swimming to the surface until they run out of air and drown. Because of this, divers who go deep into the shaft have to use a special mix of gases in their tanks, usually with much lower levels of nitrogen, to prevent this condition from taking over their minds. Then, there is Stage 3. This is the final and most extreme part of the shaft. Stage 3 begins at the 200-foot mark of the eastern tunnel, right at the edge of the drop-off ledge, and it goes all the way down to the very bottom of the cave at 400 feet. This place is unbelievably hostile. The moment you swim over the drop-off ledge, all traces of sunlight vanish. It is pitch black. The tunnel also becomes incredibly narrow and tight. It constricts so much that there are sections where divers have to turn sideways and squeeze their bodies through tight gaps in the solid rock. Because the space is so confined, it is almost impossible not to bump into the walls. This means that Stage 3 is almost always completely silted out. You are swimming in total darkness through a thick cloud of white powder, unable to see anything. At these extreme depths, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed to set in, even if you are breathing a special gas mix. Divers have to be constantly monitoring their mental state, ready to abort the dive and turn back at the very first sign of confusion or dizziness. But even if you manage to keep your head and you turn around to make your way back up, Stage 3 has one more deadly trap waiting for you. Along the ceiling of the Stage 3 tunnel, there are several offshoots called false domes. These are vertical pockets in the rock ceiling that look exactly like the way out. When a diver is low on oxygen, completely blind from the silt, and starting to panic, they will look up and see these domes. They look like chimneys that lead straight up to safety. But they are a trap. They are dead ends. If you swim up into a false dome, you will find yourself trapped against a solid rock ceiling. In the darkness and the silt, it is incredibly easy to get turned around, and many divers have spent their final, desperate minutes swimming in circles inside these false domes, trying to find a way out until their air tanks finally went completely dry. Because of these extreme dangers, Stage 3 is strictly reserved for the most experienced cave divers in the world, and you need special permission just to go near it. Now, fast forward to May 28th, 1973. On this day, a group of 8 divers arrived at the large, quiet field in southeastern Australia. They had received official permission to dive the first and second stages of the shaft. They did not have permission to go into Stage 3, and they had promised to stay away from the deep eastern tunnel past the drop-off ledge. This group of 8 was made up of friends who were all very passionate about diving. Among them were 3 siblings: Glenn, who was 25 years old, Stephen, who was 22, and their younger sister, Christine, who was only 19. They were a close-knit family, and they loved going on outdoor adventures together. The other divers in the group included 24-year-old Larry Reynolds, 28-year-old Roberts, and 20-year-old John. All 8 of these divers were very experienced in open water environments. They had spent years diving in the ocean, exploring reefs, and swimming in clear coastal waters. They were very confident in their abilities. But the problem was, none of them had ever done a cave dive before. They had no cave diving certifications, and they did not understand the unique, terrifying challenges of diving in an enclosed underground space. They were highly confident, but they were also incredibly naive. They genuinely believed that diving down to the edge of the drop-off ledge would be a simple, fun, and routine dive. But before any of them had even dipped a toe into the water, they had already made a critical, life-threatening mistake. Because they were planning on diving down to the 200-foot mark, which is well into Stage 2, they were legally and safety-wise required to fill their tanks with a special, low-nitrogen gas mixture. This was essential to prevent nitrogen narcosis at that depth. But instead of doing this, the group decided to just fill their tanks with regular compressed air. They did not want to go through the trouble or expense of getting the special gas mix, or perhaps they simply did not believe the warnings about nitrogen narcosis. By filling their tanks with regular air, they were essentially guaranteeing that once they reached the deep parts of the cave, they would become severely mentally impaired. They would be completely drunk on nitrogen, unable to think clearly or make rational decisions. Once they had all of their gear prepped and laid out in the grass, they walked over to the small 1-foot hole in the middle of the pasture. One by one, they were harnessed up and lowered down through the narrow rock opening. They splashed into the cool water below, and their heavy tanks and gear were lowered down after them. They floated there in the dark, treading water, helping each other strap on their heavy equipment and adjust their masks. Once everyone was fully geared up and ready, they turned on their flashlights and grabbed onto the permanent safety line. They began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes for the group of 8 to swim down through the crystal clear water of Stage 1 and reach the top of the rock pile at 120 feet. When they got there, they were absolutely amazed by the beauty of the cave. The water was so clear that it felt like they were floating in midair. They spent about 5 minutes gathered around the top of the rock pile, laughing through their regulators and taking photos of each other with their underwater cameras. The bright flashes of their cameras illuminated the ancient stone walls, capturing images of a happy group of friends on an exciting adventure. After they finished taking photos, they decided to head down the eastern tunnel. They began swimming down the steep slope of the rock pile, moving deeper into Stage 2. As they went deeper, the natural sunlight from the hole above began to fade away, and the cave grew very dark. They turned on their powerful flashlights, their beams cutting through the clear water. Soon, they reached the end of Stage 2, arriving at the famous drop-off ledge at 200 feet. At this point, Glenn looked at his brother Stephen, his sister Christine, and the other 5 divers. Everyone seemed to be doing completely fine. They were all gathered around the edge of the ledge, taking turns peering over the cliff into the pitch-black abyss of Stage 3 below them. It was a fascinating and mysterious sight, and they were all mesmerized by the deep, dark void. They stood there for about 5 minutes, just looking down into the darkness. At this point, Glenn decided to check his air gauge. When he looked at the needle, he saw that his air was getting fairly low. It was not a sudden emergency, but they had been underwater for a while, and because of the great depth, they were consuming their air very quickly. Glenn knew that they had reached the limit of their dive, and that it was time to turn around and head back to the surface. He knew that everyone else in the group had started with the same amount of air as him, so they must all be running low as well. Glenn looked in front of him and saw his 19-year-old sister, Christine. She was floating just a few feet ahead of him, still staring intently down over the ledge into the darkness of Stage 3. Glenn swam forward, reaching out his hand to tap her on the shoulder to signal to her that it was time to go up. But just as his hand was about to touch her shoulder, something completely unexpected happened. Christine and all the other divers suddenly leaped forward. They did not just drift down, they actively swam with hard, aggressive kicks, diving straight over the drop-off ledge and plunging deep into the forbidden abyss of Stage 3. They completely vanished into the darkness. Glenn was absolutely stunned. This was not part of the plan. Nobody had said anything about going past the ledge. It was incredibly dangerous, they did not have permission, and they were running low on air. Glenn did not realize that his siblings and friends were already suffering from severe nitrogen narcosis. The high levels of nitrogen in their regular air tanks had reached a toxic level in their brains, making them feel completely invincible and stripping away their sense of danger. To them, diving into the dark abyss felt like a fun, exciting idea. Glenn immediately swam down over the ledge after them, desperately trying to catch up to his sister, his brother, or anyone else to grab them and pull them back. But the moment he went over the edge, he ran into a wall of solid white. When the other divers had jumped over the ledge, their powerful fin kicks had disturbed the thick limestone silt on the rocks. A massive cloud of white powder had exploded into the water, completely silting out the tunnel. Glenn found himself in total, absolute darkness, surrounded by a blinding white fog. His flashlight beam could not cut through it at all. He realized instantly that he was not going to find them in this blindness, and that staying down there in the silt was incredibly dangerous for him. He figured that they would quickly realize how bad the visibility was, turn around, and swim back up to safety. He thought the best thing he could do was to return to the rock pile and wait for them to emerge from the silt cloud. So Glenn turned around, swam back up over the drop-off ledge, and made his way to the rock pile at 120 feet. He sat there in the clear water, facing the entrance of the eastern tunnel, waiting for his siblings and friends to appear. But they did not come out. He sat there, watching his air gauge tick lower and lower, a terrible feeling of dread growing in his stomach. He started thinking to himself that if his air was this low, what on earth were they doing down there in the dark? Meanwhile, 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers who had jumped over the ledge with Christine, Stephen, and the others. Larry would later explain that he did not really know why they did it. The nitrogen narcosis had clouded his thinking, and he just went along with the group. But the moment they dropped over the ledge and entered Stage 3, the environment changed dramatically. The tunnel instantly went pitch black, and the walls began to close in around them. It was not a wide-open cavern anymore. It was a tight, suffocating pipe of solid rock. As they kept swimming down, the tunnel became so incredibly narrow that they could no longer swim normally. They had to drop down onto their stomachs and literally pull themselves along the rocky floor, dragging their heavy tanks behind them. After a few minutes of forcing themselves through this extremely tight, terrifying space, it was as if a sudden wave of reality hit the group. The euphoria of the nitrogen narcosis began to mix with a sharp, cold sense of panic. They collectively realized that they had made a horrible mistake and that they needed to get out of there immediately. They all began trying to turn their bodies around in the cramped tunnel. But because the space was so tight, their movement was chaotic. Their arms, legs, and fins banged violently against the walls and ceiling. This caused a massive, instant silt-out. The entire tunnel was filled with a thick, blinding cloud of limestone powder. Larry was at the very back of the group as they began their desperate attempt to swim back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only about 25 feet away. Directly in front of Larry was 19-year-old Christine. Because of the heavy silt, Larry could not see anything around him. The only thing his flashlight could penetrate was the water directly in front of his face, where he could barely make out the white tips of Christine's diving fins. Larry locked his eyes onto those fins. He knew that if he lost sight of them, he would be completely lost in the dark. He stayed right on her tail, kicking hard, keeping his light focused on those moving fins. But after only a few moments of swimming through the blinding white cloud, Christine's fins suddenly vanished from his sight. They just disappeared. Larry was terrified. He did not know which way she had gone, but he knew he was almost completely out of air. He did not have the time to stop and search. He had to keep moving forward, praying that he was swimming in the right direction towards the exit. He kept kicking through the darkness, and after a few agonizing seconds, he finally broke through the silt cloud. He swam up and over the drop-off ledge, emerging back into the clear water of the eastern tunnel. He immediately turned around and shone his flashlight back down towards the ledge, expecting to see Christine and the others right behind him. But when he looked, the water was completely clear, and there was absolutely no one there. Not a single diver had followed him out. Larry looked at his air gauge. It was dangerously low, but he had just enough air to make one quick attempt to find them. He could not bear the thought of leaving his friends behind in the dark. So, he turned around, swam back over the drop-off ledge, and plunged back into the thick, blinding silt cloud of Stage 3. He moved very slowly and cautiously, keeping his hand on the rock ceiling to guide himself. As he made his way deeper into the tunnel, he suddenly noticed a faint dancing light up ahead. He looked closer and realized that the light was coming from above him, shining down through the silt. He swam towards the light, and when he looked up, he saw that he was standing directly beneath a large false dome in the ceiling. Inside this vertical pocket of rock, he could see the shapes of two divers. It was Christine and 28-year-old Roberts. They were frantically swimming around inside the dome, shining their flashlights in all directions, desperately trying to find a way out. They did not realize that they had swam up into a dead-end chimney and that the solid rock ceiling above them was trapping them. They were completely lost, panicking, and running out of time. Larry realized what was happening, and he immediately raised his hand to shine his flashlight directly at them to get their attention and guide them down to the exit. But at that exact second, Larry's flashlight went completely dead. The bulb went dark, and Larry was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. He was trapped in a heavy silt cloud hundreds of feet underground, with no light and almost no air left in his tank. The panic hit him like a physical blow. He began frantically banging the flashlight against his hand, desperately trying to get the battery connection to work. After a few seconds of pure terror, the light suddenly flickered back on. But in those few seconds of darkness, Larry had drifted. He was no longer directly underneath the entrance to the false dome. He shone his light around, trying to find his bearings. When he pointed his flashlight in the opposite direction, down into the deeper part of the Stage 3 tunnel where the water was still clear of silt, he saw a haunting sight. Way down in the distance, barely visible in the dim beam of his light, there was a single diver. It was 20-year-old John. John was swimming entirely alone, moving in the wrong direction, heading deeper and deeper down into the pitch-black abyss of the cave. He was completely under the influence of severe nitrogen narcosis, totally unaware that he was swimming to his death. Larry knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to save John. John was too far away, and Larry was almost completely out of air. Larry turned back towards the silt, desperately trying to find the opening to the false dome where Christine and Roberts were trapped. He rubbed his hands along the rock ceiling, searching for the gap, but the silt was too thick and he could not find it. He checked his air gauge again. The needle was bouncing on empty. He knew with absolute certainty that if he stayed in that tunnel for even one more minute, he would run out of air and drown right there alongside them. He had to make the most agonizing decision a person could ever make. He had to give up the search and save his own life. Larry turned away from the false dome, swam back through the silt, and pushed himself over the drop-off ledge. He scrambled up the steep slope of the eastern tunnel, reached the rock pile, grabbed the permanent safety line, and swam as fast as he could up to the surface. When Larry finally broke through the surface of the water inside the narrow shaft, he ripped his regulator out of his mouth and gasped for air. He looked around the cramped, water-filled space. There were only 3 other divers floating there with him. One of them was Glenn. Glenn looked at Larry's panicked face and immediately began to scream. He asked Larry where his brother and sister were and if the others were right behind him. Larry just looked at Glenn, his eyes wide with horror, and slowly shook his head. He did not know how to tell Glenn that his family was gone. But Glenn refused to accept it. This was his baby brother Stephen and his baby sister Christine. He could not just leave them down there in the dark. Glenn knew his own air tank was almost completely empty, but he did not care. He put his regulator back into his mouth, turned around, and dove straight back down into the dark water. He swam as fast as he could, pushing his body to the absolute limit, staring down towards the opening of the eastern tunnel. He was praying with everything he had that he would see his brother, his sister, or his friends emerge from the darkness. He swam down to the rock pile, but his tank was completely dry. He was sucking on empty metal. With no air left to breathe, Glenn was forced to turn around and make the long, agonizing swim back to the surface. As he floated back up to the light, the devastating reality washed over him. His siblings and his friends were never coming back. The police were immediately notified, and a massive recovery operation was launched. But because the shaft is one of the most dangerous and complex cave systems in the world, the recovery was not a simple task. It was incredibly hazardous for the search divers. They had to deal with the extreme depth, the tight spaces, the total darkness, and the constant threat of silt outs and nitrogen narcosis. The recovery team had to move with extreme caution to avoid losing more lives. It would ultimately take 11 months and 11 days of painstaking, dangerous work to locate and recover all 4 of the bodies from the depths of the cave. When the recovery divers finally reached the deepest parts of Stage 3, they found the victims, and the positions of their bodies told the heartbreaking story of their final moments. 20-year-old John, whom Larry had seen swimming in the wrong direction, was found lying on a rocky outcropping very far down the eastern tunnel. He had swum deep into the abyss under the influence of the narcosis until his air ran out and he collapsed onto the rocks. Glenn's 22-year-old brother, Stephen, was actually found floating just 50 feet below the surface near the entrance of the shaft. Investigators believe that Stephen had died at a much greater depth, but over the 11 months, the gases in his body had caused him to float up through the tunnels until he reached the upper section of the cave. But the most devastating discovery was made inside the false dome. When the recovery divers swam up into that dead-end pocket of rock in the ceiling, they found 19-year-old Christine and 28-year-old Roberts. They were floating there, locked in a tight, desperate embrace. Investigators reconstructed what happened to them in those final, terrifying minutes. They realized that when they were trapped inside the dome, they had tried frantically to find the way out. But in the pitch-black, silt-filled water, they could not find the opening. Eventually, they looked at their air gauges and saw that they had only minutes of air left. They realized that even if they managed to find the exit right then, they did not have enough air to make the long swim back to the surface. They were going to die, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. Realizing that their deaths were imminent, they decided to stop searching. They abandoned their desperate struggle, and instead of panicking in their final moments, they wrapped their arms around each other. They held each other tight in the dark, comforting one another as their air slowly ran out, and they drifted into unconsciousness together. When their air was completely gone, they drowned in each other's arms. After they passed away, their bodies eventually drifted down and out of the false dome, where they were later found. Following this unspeakable tragedy, the Australian government immediately stepped in. The shaft was permanently closed to all divers, and a heavy metal grate was installed over the small hole in the field to prevent anyone else from ever entering the deadly cave. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the global diving community, and it became a textbook case of the extreme dangers of cave diving without proper training, equipment, and respect for the environment. Years later, after strict cave diving guidelines and certification programs were established, the cave was eventually reopened, but only to highly certified, elite cave divers who possessed the proper training and specialized equipment required to survive its deadly depths. But for Glenn, the survivor, and the families of those who died, the open field in southeastern Australia will always be a place of immense grief, holding the memory of 4 young lives that were lost in the dark, silent depths of the shaft. The loss of these 4 young, vibrant people sent a deep ripple of grief through their families and their tight-knit community. Glenn, who had lost both his younger brother and his younger sister in a single afternoon, carried a heavy burden of survival guilt for the rest of his life. He often spoke about how quickly a day of adventure, laughter, and high spirits turned into a dark, inescapable nightmare. The tragedy at the shaft served as a somber warning to the entire world about the absolute limits of human endurance and the unforgiving nature of the deep earth. In the months following the incident, the local coroner convened a detailed inquest to understand exactly how a group of experienced divers could make such catastrophic decisions. The investigators examined the diving equipment that was recovered from the bottom of the cave. They tested the regulators, the depth gauges, and the tanks. What they found was a stark confirmation of their theories. Every single piece of equipment had functioned perfectly. There were no mechanical failures, no ruptured hoses, and no malfunctioning valves. The tanks of the deceased divers were completely empty, confirming that they had simply breathed in every last drop of their air while trapped in the dark. The physical evidence pointed back to a singular, devastating cause of death: human error driven by the invisible, paralyzing effects of nitrogen narcosis. The public learned that the group had underestimated the physical laws of the underwater world. At a depth of 200 feet, the pressure is about 7 times greater than at the surface. Under that kind of pressure, the air you breathe becomes dense, and the high concentration of nitrogen acts directly on your central nervous system like an anesthetic. It was this mental impairment that led the group to ignore their training, ignore their low air warnings, and cross the drop-off ledge into stage 3. To an outsider, the act of diving into a pitch-black, narrow tunnel with low air seems like madness, but to someone suffering from severe narcosis, it felt perfectly reasonable, perhaps even exciting. It was a chemical illusion that lured them to the bottom of the cave and trapped them there. The recovery team itself faced immense challenges during the 11 months it took to retrieve the bodies. The divers who volunteered for the recovery mission were some of the most skilled cave divers in Australia. They had to plan every single descent with military precision. They knew that if they made even a minor mistake, they would end up joining the victims at the bottom of the cave. The recovery divers had to map out the narrow tunnels of Stage 3, install temporary guidelines, and slowly work their way through the zero-visibility silt clouds. Every time they located a body, they had to carefully navigate it through the narrow, twisting passages of the rock ceiling and up the steep slope of the eastern tunnel to the rock pile. It was a physically exhausting and emotionally draining task that took a heavy toll on everyone involved. The recovery of Christine and Roberts inside the false dome was particularly difficult for the search team. When the divers first shone their lights into the vertical pocket of rock and saw the two friends locked in an embrace, they had to pause. The sight was a stark, heartbreaking reminder of the raw humanity of the victims. They were not just statistics or names on a police report. They were young people who had faced the ultimate terror of their own mortality in complete isolation. The image of their final embrace remained with the recovery divers for decades, a haunting symbol of the tragedy. The local farmers and residents of the area around Mount Gambier also felt the weight of the disaster. For nearly a year, the quiet rural field was transformed into a bustling command center for police, rescue squads, and journalists. The sound of engines, generators, and voices filled the air where only the wind and the lowing of cattle had been heard before. The small hole in the ground, which had once been a curious geological anomaly discovered by a horse, had become a focal point of national grief. Even after the recovery was completed and the equipment was packed away, the field was never quite the same. The local community held a quiet reverence for the site, knowing that 4 young souls had spent their final, desperate moments just over 100 feet beneath the soil. To prevent any future tragedies, the landowners and local authorities worked together to secure the site. A heavy concrete cap was poured over the opening, and a locked iron gate was built around it. Access to the field was strictly restricted. For years, the only people allowed near the site were authorized researchers and geological surveyors. The shaft became a silent, sealed tomb, keeping its dark secrets hidden from the world. However, the legacy of the tragedy did not end with the sealing of the cave. The disaster became a turning point for the diving community in Australia and around the world. Up until 1973, cave diving was a largely unregulated sport. Anyone with standard open water scuba gear could walk up to a sinkhole or a cave and jump in. There were no standardized safety protocols, no mandatory training programs, and no official certifications for cave environments. The loss of 4 young lives at the shaft changed everything. It forced the diving community to realize that cave diving required a completely different set of skills, equipment, and psychological preparation than open water diving. In response to the tragedy, a group of dedicated Australian divers came together to form the Cave Divers Association of Australia. This organization was established with a singular, clear mission: to ensure that a disaster like the one at the shaft would never happen again. They began mapping the sinkholes and caves of the region, categorizing them based on their difficulty and depth. They developed rigorous training courses that taught divers how to navigate siltouts, how to use guidelines, how to manage gas supplies, and how to recognize and manage the symptoms of nitrogen narcosis. They also instituted a strict classification system for divers, ensuring that only those with advanced training and proven experience could access the most dangerous caves. The shaft itself was eventually reopened under this new regulatory framework. Today, it is classified as a Category 3 cave, which is the highest and most restricted level. Only divers who hold a deep cave certification and have logged hundreds of hours of complex dives are permitted to enter. The entry process is still just as difficult as it was in 1973. Divers must still be lowered down through the narrow 1-foot opening without their gear, and they must still put on their heavy tanks while treading water in the dark. But today, they carry multiple backup lights, redundant breathing systems, and tanks filled with precise helium, nitrogen, oxygen gas mixtures that eliminate the threat of nitrogen narcosis. They also use heavy, secure guidelines that run from the surface all the way into the deepest recesses of the cave, ensuring they can always find their way back to the exit, even in a total siltout. The strict rules and advanced technology have made a massive difference. Since the implementation of these safety standards, the number of fatal accidents in the caves of southeastern Australia has dropped dramatically. The tragic loss of Glenn, Stephen, Christine, and their friends was not in vain. Their story became the foundation upon which modern cave diving safety was built. Every diver who enters the shaft today does so with a deep sense of respect and caution, knowing the history of the place and the lives that were lost to establish the rules they now follow. But despite the safety of modern diving, the shaft remains an intimidating, mysterious place. When you descend past the rock pile and look down into the eastern tunnel, you are still staring into the same cold, silent void that claimed those 4 young lives in 1973. The water is still just as clear, the darkness is still just as absolute, and the limestone silt is still waiting on the walls, ready to blind anyone who makes a careless move. The cave does not care about human skill or advanced technology. It remains a beautiful, indifferent monument to the power of nature. For the families of the victims, the pain of that day in May never truly went away. Glenn, who had to make the agonizing choice to return to the surface while his brother and sister were trapped below, lived a quiet life, always carrying the memory of his siblings with him. He often thought about how close he had been to reaching Christine, how his hand had been just inches away from her shoulder before she vanished into the silt. The what-ifs of that day haunted him, a silent shadow that followed him through the years. He knew that he had made the right choice to save his own life, but the heart does not always listen to logic, and the grief of a brother is a heavy thing to carry. The story of the shaft is a powerful reminder of how quickly a normal, happy day can turn into a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. It is a story about the boundaries of human curiosity, the deceptive beauty of the natural world, and the silent, deadly trap that lies just beneath our feet. It teaches us that nature must be approached with humility, respect, and a deep understanding of our own limitations. When we push past those limits, when we ignore the warnings and rely on our own confidence, the consequences can be permanent and devastating. As you look out over the peaceful green pastures of southeastern Australia today, you would never guess that such a dark, dramatic history is buried beneath the soil. The cows still graze in the sun, the wind still rustles the grass, and the small hole in the ground remains, a tiny window into a massive, silent world of rock and water. It is a place of incredible beauty, but also a place of profound sorrow, a quiet tomb for the dreams of 4 young adventurers who dared to explore the deep and never returned. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.